On that street, time seemed frozen in a kind of numbing calm. The houses were all the same, in a way that seemed designed to soothe the eyes, like it was saying nothing here would ever change. The pattern of their light brick facades, their aligned roofs, and symmetrical gardens made that neighborhood the picture of suburban perfection. And for a long time, I believed that lie. It was the kind of place where mornings were filled with bird song, the newspaper was folded precisely and left at the door, and people left for work at the same time every day. Neighbors smiled at each other, exchanged vague nods, and made small talk about the weather, football, or grocery prices. Everything was absurdly normal. I had moved there just a few months earlier, seeking that very sense of peace and stability. After a few chaotic years in the city, I needed a place to start over, to find myself again. And at first, that neighborhood seemed perfect. However, it didn't take long for the surface of that normalcy to start cracking. At first, it was small things easy to ignore, a strange feeling of being watched, even when I was alone at home, a reflection in a window that seemed a bit delayed. Maybe it was stress, I thought, the fatigue of a life full of responsibilities. But there was something deeper, something I couldn't quite identify, but it lingered in the air like a shadow in the corner of your eye that disappears whenever you try to look directly at it. As the weeks went by, that feeling of discomfort began to intensify. It wasn't something obvious, and maybe that's why it took me so long to notice. But gradually, the surface of normality in that neighborhood began to unravel. What once seemed like mere coincidence or an insignificant detail became impossible to ignore. First, it was the smiles. Not all of them, just those of my closest neighbors, the ones I saw every day. Mrs. Kadia, who lived in the house to the left, the Matos couple in the house to the right, and the twin brothers who lived across the street. At first, they were polite, courteous, even friendly, but there was something wrong with the way their faces contorted when they greeted me. The smile never reached their eyes. They'd bare their teeth, perfectly white and aligned, but their eyes remained frozen, lifeless. One day, I ran into Mrs. Kadia in her garden. She was standing there, staring blankly at the sky. She seemed distracted, but when I greeted her, her head turned slowly, at an angle that didn't seem natural, as if her muscles were being pulled the wrong way. Her smile appeared suddenly, too fast, without any kind of transition, like it had been switched on. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile back. "Good morning," she said, but her voice was cold, almost mechanical, and then she turned back to the sky, as if I wasn't even there. I tried to ignore these incidents, rationalizing them as symptoms of my stress and anxiety. Maybe I was becoming paranoid, but the more I tried to brush off these sensations, the stronger they became. The neighbors seemed to act stranger with each passing day. It was as if they were poorly playing characters in a bad play, awkwardly going through the motions of their routines, but without any real authenticity. I started noticing odd details. How they all left their houses at the exact same time every day, or how the sound of footsteps echoed through the night, but no one was ever in the streets. Time also began to behave strangely. Sometimes I'd look at the clock and notice that hours had passed when, to me, it felt like only a few minutes. Other times, the opposite would happen. I'd swear hours had dragged by, but when I looked at the clock, only a few minutes had ticked away. The world around me seemed fragmented, as if reality was being distorted. But the strangest thing happened one night. I was at home, reading a book, when I heard something outside. It was the sound of laughter, light and almost childlike, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. I moved closer to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to peek out, and that's when I saw them. My neighbors, all of them, standing together in the street, frozen under the yellow glow of the streetlights, laughing quietly. They were completely still, their bodies aligned in a precise, almost artificial way. The laughter was perfectly synchronized, echoing through the silent night. And then suddenly it stopped. All at once, I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. When I looked again, they were gone, as if they'd never been there at all. After that night, I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Something was terribly wrong in that neighborhood. The empty smiles, the mechanical behaviors, and those synchronized laughs that echoed in my mind. None of it made sense. I tried to go back to my routine, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease from my mind. I needed to find out what was going on. That's when I started watching more closely. During the day, I'd leave the house early, pretending to go to work, but in reality, I stayed nearby, watching from a distance, trying to spot a pattern, something that could explain what was wrong. And little by little, I began to notice things I hadn't seen before. The Matos couple, for instance, never seemed to eat. I'd see them leaving their house every morning, exactly at 8 a.m., but they never carried grocery bags. Their eyes were always dry, and their clothes, though immaculate, never seemed to wear out. Mrs. Katia, on the other hand, spent hours sitting in her garden, but she never moved, except for the slow movement of her head, which would turn from side to side, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. And the twins were the worst. They were always together, always standing still, always with the same expression. They never said a word. I knew no one would believe me if I told them. Sometimes I even questioned my own sanity. But the more I watched, the clearer it became. My neighbors were not normal. They weren't human. That's when I decided to do something I knew might be dangerous. I broke into Mrs. Katia's house. There was something about her, something about that woman that bothered me deeply. She seemed wrong in a way I couldn't define, and I was determined to find out why. I waited until late afternoon. I knew she went for a walk every day, always at the same time, exactly at 5 p.m. As soon as she turned the corner, I walked toward her house, trying to appear casual. My eyes scanned the street to make sure no one was watching, but the windows were closed and the curtains drawn. When I reached her front door, my heart was pounding in my chest. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it wasn't locked. A detail that in any other circumstance would have been strange. But at that moment, I didn't think about it. I just walked in. The house was as cold as its owner's presence. There was nothing personal on the walls or furniture. The shelves were empty, without family photos or objects that showed who she was. The decor was minimalist, almost sterile, as if no one really lived there. Heavy curtains blocked out the sunlight, casting a dim shadow that seemed to swallow the rooms. As I walked through the halls, something caught my attention: the absolute silence. There wasn't a sound, not even from my own footsteps, as if the air in that house was dead. I went to the kitchen. The drawers were all empty. No plates, no cutlery, nothing that suggested anyone used that space. A knot began to form in my stomach. Something was very wrong here. Then I saw the door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and from where I stood, I could hear a low, constant humming like some kind of electronic buzzing. Something in me hesitated, like my body knew that crossing that door would be a mistake. But my curiosity, or my desperation for answers, was stronger. When I pushed the door open, I was immediately hit by a strong chemical smell, like I had just walked into a laboratory. And there, in the center of the room, was something I never could have predicted. A table, or what seemed like a metal table with wires and tubes connected to some sort of machine, and on it, a form almost human. I stepped closer, each step more difficult than the last, and when I looked closely, I realized the body on that table was Mrs. Katia, or rather, something that looked like her. But her skin was pale, translucent, and there were openings where thin tubes came out, connected to that strange machine. What frightened me most was the fact that, even though her eyes were closed, she seemed alive. Her chest rose and fell in a rhythmic, but artificial way, like a simulation of breathing. I instinctively backed away, stumbling. And that's when I felt something behind me. I hadn't heard footsteps, but I sensed a presence. When I turned, the doorway was occupied by her, Mrs. Katia. But something was different. Her face, once still, now trembled, her eyes wide, and her smile, stretched beyond the limits of her face, like it was being forced to expand. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, blocking the exit. The humming in the room intensified, and my vision started to blur. The world around me seemed to warp, as if time and space were fragile illusions, about to unravel before me. I froze. Mrs. Kadia's smile, or whatever was pretending to be her, stretched grotesquely, tearing the skin of her face in an inhuman way. Her once slender and stiff body now trembled slightly, as if something inside her was about to break free. Her head was twitching erratically from side to side, and her dull, vacant eyes were locked onto me, reacting only to my presence, without any real understanding. Panic took over. I had to get out of there. My body felt numb with terror, but I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward. The humming in the room grew louder, like a swarm of flies buzzing inside my head. The room around me seemed to shrink, the walls slowly closing in, as if space itself was folding in on me. Without thinking, I turned toward the door, my shoulder colliding with Mrs. Kadia, or whatever was left of her. Her body felt cold and rigid to the touch, like she was already dead, even though her eyes continued to stare at me, empty. As I pushed her aside, I felt her skin give way under my fingers in an unnatural way, as if there were no muscles or bones beneath, just a gelatinous substance imitating flesh. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing distortedly through the house. The sound didn't match the rhythm of my steps. It was as if time itself was slipping, each second stretched or compressed. I tried to process what I had just seen, but my mind refused to understand. How could this be real? What was happening to my neighbors? When I reached the front door, I pulled at the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The same door that had been unlocked earlier was now inexplicably sealed shut. My heart raced even faster, sweat pouring down my temples. I glanced back toward the dark hallway, but there was no sign of Mrs. Kadia. However, the feeling of being watched persisted, like something was lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. I had no other choice. I rushed up the stairs, hoping to find an escape. The windows, maybe. But as I passed one of the rooms upstairs, I was met with an even more disturbing sight. Standing perfectly still were the Motto's couple. They were facing a window, staring blankly outside, but their faces were turned toward me. How had they gotten there? It made no sense. They hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. They just stared at me with that same forced smile, their eyes empty and dead. I tried to ignore their presence and headed straight for the window. With trembling hands, I pulled the curtains aside. But what I saw on the other side wasn't the street, nor the neighborhood houses. It was nothing, an absolute void. The darkness was total, and when I pressed my hand against the glass, I realized it wasn't cold, as it should have been. It was warm and pulsing faintly, like I was touching the skin of some living organism. I immediately backed away, horror rising in my throat. My stomach churned. That wasn't a window. This wasn't even a house. The reality around me was unraveling, or worse, it was being replaced by something entirely different, something alien. The Motto's couple remained motionless, still staring at me. Then, slowly, as if responding to an inaudible command, they began to turn their heads in perfect synchrony. The sound of their joints creaking was one of the most disturbing noises I had ever heard. The flesh around their necks seemed to stretch beyond its natural limits, and their mouths opened slowly, revealing rows of sharp, deformed teeth, something that didn't belong in a human mouth. That was the final proof. They weren't human. I backed up against the wall, panic flooding every cell in my body. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where could I go? Everything around me had lost its logic. The house itself seemed to be changing, the corridors stretching, and the doors disappearing. The feeling of being swallowed by something larger than myself, something beyond human understanding, was overwhelming. I tried to force myself to think rationally, but I no longer knew what was real. My neighbors weren't people. What I had seen in Mrs. Kadia's house couldn't be explained by any earthly logic. It seemed like all of this was part of something bigger, something beyond my ability to comprehend. Suddenly, The house began to vibrate slightly, and the low, incessant hum grew louder. It was almost as if the very structure was breathing. The air became dense, heavy, and an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia washed over me. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. I had to escape that house. The pulsing in the walls grew stronger, and with each passing second, it felt like the world around me was becoming stranger, more distorted. The floor seemed to tilt slightly, and the shadows on the walls moved in ways they shouldn't. I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. I ran back into the hallway, avoiding the Motto's couple's gaze, their heads twisted at impossible angles. My breathing was ragged, my body trembling with fear. I had to find a way out. Any way out. I stumbled down the stairs, fighting against the growing sense that the space around me was shifting according to a logic I couldn't understand. I reached the living room, and the air there felt even heavier. The house was vibrating, as if it had a rhythm of its own, and the buzzing sound that I had heard in Mrs. Kadia's room now filled the space, reverberating through my bones. When I looked at the front door, where there had once been a simple exit, it was different. There was no longer a handle, and the wood seemed alive. Soft waves rippled across its surface, as if the house itself was absorbing every trace of its human structure. It was too late. I was trapped. In desperation, I made one last attempt to open the living room window. I yanked the curtains aside, only to find the same pulsating darkness I'd seen upstairs. But this time, the darkness seemed to be moving. Something out there, or what I had thought was out there, was shifting, coming closer. When I touched the glass, I felt that same warmth, that same sense of touching something alive. I recoiled, my stomach twisting with revulsion. I was surrounded. There was no doubt anymore. The people I had once called neighbors, those who had pretended to live normal lives, were something else entirely. And worse, they were everywhere. The street, the houses, everything around me was part of a lie, a carefully constructed illusion to deceive me. It was then that I realized the truth was far more terrifying than I had imagined. Mrs. Kadia appeared at the entrance to the living room, but she was no longer the familiar figure of an elderly woman. Her body had completely changed. Her pale skin was now translucent, revealing veins and organs that weren't human. Her legs were longer, grotesquely stretched, and her arms twisted at impossible angles. Her mouth, oh, that terrible mouth, was open in a jagged grin that stretched across half of her face, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth, like something monstrous was wearing her body as a mask. Behind her, the other neighbors began to appear. The Motto's couple, the twins, they were all changing, their bodies twisting into horrifying shapes. Flesh stretched, bones realigned, turning them into something I could barely process. The body horror unfolding in front of me was indescribable, and with each passing second, they moved closer, slowly, like predators savoring the anticipation of their prey. My thoughts were spiraling. I was being consumed by terror. What were they? Why had they pretended to be human for so long? And more importantly, why me? Why was I still alive? If there was no escape, then something inside me snapped. I realized, with a cold clarity, that they weren't just aliens or monsters. They were something beyond that. Something ancient. Something that existed before any human concept of reality. They were projections of a greater consciousness, incomprehensible to the human mind. Cosmic entities whose intentions and nature went beyond any understanding. They weren't just watching me. They were studying me. The revelation hit me like a shockwave. My reality, everything I believed to be real, was nothing but a fragile shell, held together by a thin layer of normality. And now, that layer was crumbling. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the constant humming that now filled the air. The house was alive. My neighbors, these entities, were part of it, part of something much larger, much more terrifying. They weren't just inhabitants of this place. They were the place. And in my ignorance, I had become part of this macabre experiment. As the creatures closed in, distorted and grotesque, I realized that there was no longer a difference between the house, the world outside, and the monsters before me. Everything was part of the same thing, the same entity that fed on my sanity, trapping me in an endless cycle of fear and horror. Time no longer made sense. I no longer made sense. My mind began to unravel, fragmented by the perception of reality bending around me. The creatures loomed over me, and as their inhuman forms surrounded me, I finally understood the most terrifying secret of all. They were never human, and I was never safe. The storm rages on, whipping against Clara's windshield. The sound of the rain and wind is almost deafening. My fingers grip the steering wheel, and my heart feels like it's about to leap out of my chest. The car's headlights barely cut through the thick darkness, but soon I see the twisted skeletal shapes of the abandoned hospital rising before me. This hospital, the place where Eva disappeared. I shouldn't be here, but something brought me back. Something I can't ignore. 2 years ago, she vanished within these walls, and since then, every night has been torment. The guilt eats away at me, whispering that I could have done more, that I should have pushed harder. Now I get a plea for help, and signed, just the words, "She's still here. Come." And so I came. As soon as I stop the car, the engine goes silent, but the heavy feeling in the air doesn't fade. I stare at the dark, decaying building in front of me. The shadows in the windows seem to move, but that can't be real. It can't. I take a deep breath and put my hand on the door handle, hesitating for a moment. Just as I'm about to get out, I hear it. A faint voice, muffled by the rain, but unmistakable. "Clara." My blood runs cold. The sound is coming from inside the hospital. Eva's voice. I step into the hospital, the door creaking and echoing down the empty hallways. The air here is different, heavier, thicker. My flashlight flickers across the moisture-stained walls, revealing patches of peeling paint and signs of time when this place was full of life. Now it's dead, but still, something seems to be watching. The floor creaks under my feet, and the silence is only broken by the constant dripping of water from leaks scattered throughout the building. Each step is a reminder that I'm alone, but at the same time, a strange feeling creeps over me, as if I'm not so alone after all. The sense of being watched is constant, but there's nothing. No figures in the shadows, no movement other than my own. I walk slowly, each hallway darker than the last. My eyes adjust to the gloom, but my body stays tense, ready for something to appear out of nowhere at any moment. My breathing is shallow, uneven, and I try to focus. I have to find Eva, but as I continue, something catches my eye. An old, yellow diary lying on the floor. I crouch down and open its pages, my fingers trembling slightly. Medical notes. Something disturbing. Accounts of patients who were admitted and never left. Mysterious cases of disappearances. One name stands out to me. Eva. Was she one of these patients? My stomach twists, and fear begins to tighten its grip on my chest. I stand with the diary in hand, but before I can process anything, the sound of something or someone whispering reaches my ears. The echo of distant voices, almost indistinguishable. "Clara." The whisper is now clearer, closer. My feet move almost reflexively, walking toward the sound, even though every cell in my body wants to flee. The hospital, with its endless corridors and narrow walls, feels like a maze, and every turn I make is a trap. I feel the chill in the air intensify, and a shiver runs down my spine. Am I alone or not? The whispers pull me deeper into the hospital. I'm not sure exactly where I'm headed, but something, maybe Eva's voice, seems to guide my steps. I try to ignore the growing fear inside me, but the sense that I'm being watched only gets stronger. My flashlight begins to fail, flickering every few seconds. Each time the light goes out, I hold my breath, waiting for it to reveal something or someone when it comes back on. Suddenly there ahead of me a figure. I can't see it clearly, but it looks like a person standing at the end of the hallway. My flashlight flickers, casting light on the silhouette, which remains still, as if waiting for me. My heart races. The figure doesn't seem threatening at first glance. It looks fragile, lost. "Eva," my voice comes out hesitant, almost a whisper. The figure doesn't respond, but takes a step back, disappearing into the shadows before I can move. I approach slowly, my entire body tense, every muscle warning me of danger. But the hope of finding my sister is stronger than the fear. "Clara." The voice is now clearer, closer, and for sure, it's hers. I turn the corner, but there's no one there. The silence is suffocating, and the hospital seems to be playing tricks on my mind. I pick up the diary I found earlier, and as I flip through its pages, the truth begins to emerge. The notes speak of experiments, of bizarre treatments on terminally ill patients, tests conducted at the edge of life on people near death. The descriptions are vague, but one thing is clear. Those who entered these experiments, including Eva, never left. My hands tremble. What did they do to her here? I think, panic beginning to take hold of me. Whatever happened in this hospital, it wasn't natural. And now, the apparitions I've seen, the feeling of being watched, everything starts to make sense. As I try to comprehend it all, I hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turn, but there's nothing. The sound continues, echoing through the empty hallways, like someone is following me, but keeping their distance. The voices draw me deeper into the darkness, and reality begins to distort. The hospital seems to transform around me, the hallways growing longer, the walls closing in. It's as if the very space is bending, trapping me in a nightmare I can't escape. I try to focus, but Eva's voice is getting closer, almost right next to me. I enter a large room, filled with old, dusty surgical equipment. In the center of the room, I see a familiar figure, Eva. She's there, her silhouette unmistakable in the weak glow of the flashlight. I run toward her, my mind screaming that it's her, that I've finally found her. But just as I'm about to reach her, the figure dissolves into shadows. It wasn't her. It never was. I scream, a desperate, helpless sound that echoes off the walls. The guilt, the pain, it all comes rushing back with full force. My mind is being toyed with, thrown around as if I'm a puppet. And I know, with growing certainty, that the hospital is playing with my sanity. The entities that inhabit this place, whether they are spirits or something worse, are using my greatest weakness against me. The guilt I feel for losing Eva. With every step I take, I feel I'm getting farther from her, not closer. And the darkness around me seems alive, pulsing, as if waiting to swallow me whole. Fleeing from the oppressive corridor, I stumble into an old archive room. Rusty metal cabinets and broken shelves line the walls, with papers scattered across the floor as if someone had left in a panic. I search through the files, desperate for any clue about what happened to Eva, and finally, my eyes land on her name. My sister was one of the terminal patients. My mind races, trying to piece everything together. Eva never told me she was sick. Why was she here? As I read on, the descriptions of the experimental treatments become more disturbing. The doctors were desperate to save patients on the brink of death, but instead of saving them, they condemned them to something worse. They didn't die, not really. Something kept them trapped between this world and the next. The weight of the revelation hits me like a tidal wave. Eva is tied to this place. She's not alive, but she's not dead either. The horror of this realization grips my chest, and the air in the room becomes harder to breathe. Suddenly, the door slams shut behind me with a loud bang. The air around me grows frigid, and the flashlight in my hand begins to flicker uncontrollably. "Clara," Eva's voice calls out again, but this time, there's something different about it. It sounds distorted, as if it's coming from a place far, far away, or from something pretending to be her. My vision begins to blur, and the dark presence I saw earlier appears at the doorway, slowly walking toward me. Every step it takes sends tremors through the ground beneath me. I'm trapped. I'm cornered. The dark figure advances slowly, each step echoing through the endless, empty hallways of the hospital. I try to control my breathing, but panic is rising, choking me. The flashlight flickers again, revealing only glimpses of the figure. It's taller than any human, denser than any shadow I've ever seen. It can't be real. It can't. But what is real here? What's just an illusion? My mind is being assaulted, bombarded with images of Eva, with the guilt I've carried since I lost her. Clara. The voice continues to call my name, but now, every time I hear it, it feels like something is ripping through me, exposing every mistake, every failure I've ever made. Suddenly, the entity shifts. It's no longer just a vague silhouette, but something familiar. Eva, or at least something that looks like her. The same height, the same hair, the same desperate look in her eyes that makes me want to run and embrace her. But deep down, I know it's not really her. This is just another trap, another trick from the hospital, a final attempt to break me completely. My legs weaken, and I'm forced to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. The hospital feels alive, pulsing around me, and the pressure in my chest grows heavier, like it's trying to crush every last bit of strength I have. "Why did you leave me?" Eva's voice asks, but there's something wrong with it, a distortion in the tone. The hospital is using my guilt against me, my greatest weakness. I have to hold on. I have to believe this isn't real. I still have the diary in my hands, its old, dirty pages crinkling under my fingers. The doctor's notes, the words that seem to resonate with some hidden truth about what happened here. I start flipping through the pages frantically, searching for something, anything that can help. And then I find a passage about rituals, something the doctors believed could sever the link between the living and those trapped in this hospital. I have to try. It's my only chance. With my eyes locked on the figure of Eva, I begin to recite the words from the diary out loud. At first, my voice is weak, trembling. The shadows around me seem to grow darker, and the entire hospital responds with a low, almost guttural sound of anger. Eva! I call her name, knowing that it's not really my sister, but needing the entity to listen to me. I keep reading, the Latin words spilling out of my mouth, their meaning unknown to me, but I can feel their power. The figure of Eva hesitates, as if it's being pushed back, and the shadows around her start to twist and contort, like smoke being pulled away. The hospital trembles, the floor vibrating under my feet, and the flashlight slips from my hand, crashing to the ground. Now, I'm in total darkness, just my voice and the growing sound of something about to break apart. I feel like I'm losing control, like the entire place is about to collapse. The walls are shaking, and there's a loud humming, as if the very air is vibrating. The dark presence begins to retreat, but it doesn't go without a fight. It makes one final attack, using Eva's voice to tear at me. "You left me. You never tried hard enough." Those words cut through me like knives, but I have to resist. I know the only way to defeat this entity is to face my guilt and forgive myself. I have to accept that I did what I could, that Eva is gone, and that it's not my fault. I close my eyes and scream, "I'm sorry. Eva, I'm so sorry. But I can't live with this pain anymore." The sound in the hospital intensifies, a shockwave rippling through the air, and then everything goes silent. I'm on my knees, the hospital around me eerily quiet. The trembling has stopped, and the dark presence is gone. The pain in my chest is still there, but it's lighter now, like a weight has been lifted. Slowly, I stand up, my muscles tense, and I turn toward the door. As I step outside, the rain still falls, but there's something different. The air feels lighter, more breathable. I walk away from the hospital, each step taking me farther from the darkness that almost consumed me. I look back one last time. The hospital still stands, shadows still linger in the windows, but something has changed. I can feel it. Maybe I freed some of the souls trapped there, or maybe the evil is just hiding, waiting for another chance. But I've been set free. The sound of rain pulls me back to reality, and I start walking to my car. I place the diary on the passenger seat, feeling like, despite everything, the story isn't over yet. The hospital may be in ruins, but its echoes still linger. As I'm about to get into the car, I hear one last whisper, barely audible in the wind. Clara. I turn around, and for a second, I see Eva's silhouette waving at me from the window. But maybe it's just my imagination. It's January 6th, 1923, and I can't keep this to myself anymore. I've tried to bury these memories for years, to convince myself they were just childhood fantasies. But something happened recently that brought everything rushing back. A week ago, my younger sister, Jane, discovered an old diary in the attic of our family home here in London. It belonged to our mother, and the handwriting was unmistakably hers. Elegant and deliberate, the kind of script you only see in proper Victorian education. At first, I thought it would just contain mundane details, recipes, household tips, maybe notes about us as children, but it wasn't that at all. The entries were strange, filled with vivid descriptions of a boy who never grows up and a place she called the land where shadows have lives of their own. The moment I read those words, something inside me froze. I recognized what she was describing, even though I had never spoken about it out loud before. When I was a child, sometime in 1901 or 1902, I had recurring dreams, or what I thought were dreams, about a boy with wild hair and an unnervingly wide grin. He would appear at my bedroom window, tapping on the glass and calling my name in a voice that sounded almost melodic, like distant bells. My mother used to tell me these were just figments of an overactive imagination, that children often dream of magical places and mysterious figures. But reading her diary, I realized she'd seen him too. She wrote about the exact same boy, the same window, the same sound of faint chiming in the air. It wasn't just in my head. The more I read, the more I felt like my chest was caving in. My mother's entries were detailed, almost frantic at times, as if she was trying to document everything before she forgot it. She wrote about how the boy, Peter, she named him in the diary, claimed to take children to a place called Neverland, where they'd never have to grow up. At first, she described it as beautiful, a paradise where time didn't matter and every day was an adventure. But as the entries went on, her tone shifted. She started mentioning strange things, the way the shadows in Neverland didn't behave as they should, how they moved on their own, creeping and lurking even when no one cast them. One entry, dated April 14th, 1875, chilled me to the bone. She wrote, "The shadows are not ours. They watch us, wait for us to falter. Peter says they're harmless, but I see the way they linger behind the lost boys. They seem hungry." I couldn't stop reading. The more I did, the more fragmented her entries became. She started questioning Peter's intentions, describing him as charming but cruel. She wrote about the lost boys, how they seemed to lose themselves over time, forgetting their families, their names, even their own faces. "Peter says it's the price of staying young," she wrote. "But I can't shake the feeling that it's not youth they're giving up, it's their souls." The last entry was the most unsettling. It was dated June 2nd, 1877, just a few years before I was born. She wrote, "He came for me again last night. He said I'd be happier if I left everything behind and returned to Neverland. But I've seen what happens to those who go back." I told him no. He smiled, but it wasn't kind. He said, "You'll regret growing up, Wendy. I haven't slept since." After reading that final entry, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The attic was cold, far colder than it should have been, and I swear I heard faint scratching sounds coming from the corners of the room. I slammed the diary shut and rushed downstairs, But even as I sat by the fireplace, I couldn't calm down. My mind kept replaying her words. "You'll regret growing up, Wendy." How did he know my name? How did he know my mother's? Was he the same Peter, still looking for her, still watching me? The next few nights were unbearable. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind against the window made my heart race. I started noticing strange things, too. Shadows moving in ways they shouldn't. Once, as I walked down the hall, I saw my own shadow stretch unnaturally long across the wall, even though the light source was right behind me. Then, just as suddenly, it snapped back into place. Another time, I swore I saw a flicker of movement outside my window, like a small figure darting out of sight. Each time, I tell myself it was just my imagination, the after effects of reading my mother's diary. But deep down, I knew better. Everything came to a head last night, January 5th, 1923. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The gas lamp in my room cast soft, flickering light, and I tried to focus on the rhythmic ticking of the clock to calm myself. Then I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. My stomach dropped. I wanted to convince myself it was just a branch or the wind, but the tapping grew more insistent, almost purposeful. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay under the covers, but my body betrayed me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. There he was, Peter, just as my mother had described him in her diary. Wild, windswept hair, a cocky grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, and that unsettling glow of youth that didn't feel natural. He waved at me like an old friend, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I froze, unable to breathe, let alone move. He tapped the glass again and gestured for me to come closer. My hands trembled as I clutched the blanket tighter around me. Then he spoke, his voice muffled, but still audible through the window. "Wendy," he said, "you've been waiting for me." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Hearing him say my name felt like an ice-cold hand gripping my spine. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stared at him, hoping that if I stayed still enough, he might disappear. But he didn't. His grin widened, and he leaned closer to the glass. "You've grown up," he said, his voice almost mocking. "But it's not too late. Come back with me, Wendy. You don't belong here." I shook my head, finally finding my voice, though it came out as a shaky whisper. "Go away." His expression darkened for a moment, but then he smiled again, this time with a sharpness that made my skin crawl. "You don't mean that," he said. "You remember, don't you? The adventures, the freedom, the fun. You were happy there. You can be happy again." He pressed his hand to the window, and I swear I saw the glass ripple like water. "Just let me in, Wendy." One last time, I scrambled out of bed, backing away from the window as fast as I could. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The moment I spoke, the air in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating. His grin vanished, replaced by a look of cold disappointment. "You don't understand, Wendy," he said, his voice no longer charming but sharp, almost threatening. "You can't just walk away from Neverland. It's a part of you. I'm a part of you." I pressed my back against the far wall, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but it didn't feel like enough. His shadow stretched across the room, impossibly long and twisted, reaching toward me like it had a life of its own. "I don't want to go back," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. He tilted his head, studying me like a predator, sizing up its prey. "Oh, Wendy," he said softly, almost pityingly. "It's not about what you want. It never was." Before I could even react, the shadow began to creep closer, slithering across the floor like liquid darkness. It moved unnaturally, defying the flickering light of the gas lamp, and I swear I could hear it whispering, low, guttural murmurs that made my head spin. "Stop!" I screamed, though I wasn't sure who I was pleading with, Peter or the shadow itself. He didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed his hand harder against the glass. and the window pane began to crack, thin lines spiderwebbing outward as if under immense pressure. "I gave you everything," Peter said, his voice now hollow and cold, devoid of the playful charm it once held. "You were happy there. You belonged there. And now you think you could just leave it all behind?" The shadow reached the edge of my bed, its dark tendrils climbing the blankets like living vines. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a small porcelain figurine from my nightstand, and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, spraying shards across the floor. Peter recoiled, his face twisting with rage, but it wasn't over. The shadow didn't retreat. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger, stretching and writhing as it filled the room. The shattered window let in a gust of icy wind that made the gas lamp flicker violently, plunging the room into moments of near darkness. The shadow was everywhere now, engulfing the floor, the walls, even the ceiling. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It felt alive, a suffocating, malevolent presence that seemed to sap the air from the room. Peter didn't move. He stood outside the window, his grin gone, replaced by an expression of something I couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe, but also triumph, as if this was exactly what he wanted. The shadow began to rise, towering over me, its form shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a storm. I stumbled backwards, slipping on the rug, and fell hard onto the floor. My body felt heavy, as if the very air was pressing down on me. And then I saw it, something within the shadow faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, distorted and faint, but there. They weren't looking at me. They were screaming, their mouths open in silent agony. One of them, for a fleeting moment, looked like my mother. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, but I forced myself to crawl backward toward the door. Peter's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and cruel. They didn't want to grow up either, Wendy, but they weren't strong enough. "Are you?" His words felt like knives, but I didn't stop. I reached the door, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the shadow had sealed it shut. I clawed at the door handle, panic taking over as the shadow crept closer, its tendrils reaching for me like they had a purpose of their own. My body felt weak, almost paralyzed, as if the air itself had turned into thick, suffocating tar. "You can't run, Wendy," Peter's voice echoed, though now it sounded like it was coming from everywhere. Inside my head, outside the window, even from the shadow itself. "You've already come back. You just don't realize it yet." With a desperate burst of strength, I kicked the door hard, again and again, until it finally gave way. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, but the shadows followed, spilling out of my room like an unholy tide. The house felt different, darker, colder, as if the shadows had begun to infect it, twisting the familiar into something hostile. I ran, tripping over my own feet, heading toward the stairs. The floorboards groaned under me, louder than they should have, and for a moment, I thought they might collapse entirely. Peter's laughter rang out behind me, high and mocking, like a child who had won a cruel game. "There's no escape," he called. "You've always belonged to me, Wendy. You just forgot." But I didn't. His words sent a chill through me, colder than the wind that whipped through the shattered window. I reached the bottom of the stairs, but the shadows were faster. They poured down the walls, pooling around me, cutting off every path to the front door. I turned sharply and bolted toward the kitchen, the only place I could think of that might still have an exit. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself forward, the shadows licking at my heels like they were alive. The kitchen was dark, the faint moonlight from the small window barely enough to see. I grabbed a knife from the counter, not knowing if it would do any good, but the cold steel in my hand was the only thing grounding me to reality. The shadows hesitated, writhing at the doorway, like they were testing my resolve. Then Peter's voice came again, softer now, almost soothing. "Wendy, you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. Just give in. You don't have to fight. You'll never have to worry again. No pain, no aging, no loss. Isn't that what you've always wanted? His words wrapped around me like a noose, and for a terrifying moment, I almost believed him. But then I remembered the faces in the shadow, the agony etched into their expressions. That wasn't freedom. It was a trap. With every ounce of courage I had, I lunged for the back door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the freezing night air. The shadows screamed, a sound that wasn't human, more like the roar of 1,000 voices in torment. I ran into the garden, the knife still clutched in my hand, but I didn't know where to go. The darkness seemed endless, and the shadows weren't retreating. They were following me, stretching out across the ground like a wave ready to swallow me whole. I ran blindly through the garden, the cold biting into my skin as I pushed past the hedges and bare trees. The shadows moved faster, spilling across the frozen ground like a flood. I glanced back once, just for a second, and wished I hadn't. Peter was there, standing at the edge of the garden, his form barely visible but unmistakable. His grin was gone, replaced with something far more sinister, something ancient and unrelenting. He raised a hand, and the shadows surged forward, overtaking the path behind me. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the knife flying from my hand into the dark. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think. The shadows were nearly on me now, reaching, twisting, their whispers louder and more frantic. Desperation took over. I clawed at the ground, dragging myself forward, and suddenly my fingers brushed something cold and metallic. The knife. I grabbed it, holding it tightly as the shadows closed in. Then, without thinking, I swung the blade at the nearest tendril of shadow. To my shock, it recoiled, writhing violently as if in pain. The whispers turned to shrieks, piercing and inhuman, and the shadows pulled back slightly, but only for a moment. They surged again, angrier this time, and I knew I couldn't keep fighting them off. I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in my ankle, and ran toward the only place that might still give me safety, the old greenhouse at the far end of the property. I reached the greenhouse, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. The glass walls did little to make me feel safe, but it was the only barrier I had. The shadows swirled outside, pressing against the frosted glass like black smoke, searching for a way in. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air inside damp and thick with the scent of soil and decay. I stumbled to the center of the greenhouse, clutching the knife like it was my only lifeline. Peter's voice came again, clear and mocking, as though he were standing right behind me. "You can't hide forever, Wendy. You're just prolonging the inevitable. You were mine then, and you'll be mine again." His voice seemed to echo, bouncing off the glass walls and filling the space. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The shadows began creeping through the cracks in the greenhouse, thin tendrils snaking along the floor toward me. I swung the knife wildly, cutting at the air, but it only slowed them for a moment. They kept coming, relentless and alive. My mind raced. There had to be something, some way to stop this. My mother's diary. Her words echoed in my head. The shadows are not ours. They watch us, wait for us to falter. I thought about those faces, the souls trapped in the darkness, and I realized something. The shadows weren't just Peter's creations. They were his victims. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. The shadows weren't just extensions of Peter. They were the remnants of those who had fallen into his trap. Children who had trusted him, who had given up their innocence and their memories for the false promise of eternal youth. My mother had been right all along. This wasn't a magical paradise. It was a prison, and Peter was its warden. The shadows closed in, surrounding me completely now, their whispers turning into anguished wails. My grip on the knife tightened, but I knew I couldn't fight them all. Then I remembered something else from my mother's diary. She had written, "He fears what he cannot control." The shadows are his slaves, but light is their master. My eyes darted around the greenhouse, searching for anything that could help. That's when I saw it. An old oil lamp hanging near the door, dusty but intact. I scrambled toward it, slashing at the shadows as they lunged for me. My fingers fumbled with the lamp, spilling oil everywhere as I worked to light it. Finally, with trembling hands, I struck a match and held it to the wick. The flame roared to life, casting a harsh, golden glow that filled the greenhouse. The shadows recoiled instantly, shrieking as they dissolved into the corners, unable to withstand the light. For the first time that night, I felt a shred of hope. The light from the lamp wasn't just pushing the shadows back. It seemed to hurt them. They writhed and twisted in the corners, their dark forms evaporating into nothingness wherever the flame touched. The oppressive whispers and shrieks grew fainter, like they were being smothered by the light. For the first time all night, I could breathe again. I held the lamp high, moving toward the door, the shadows retreating from me like wounded animals. But then I heard him, Peter. His voice was no longer mocking. It was cold, sharp, and furious. "You think you've won?" he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You don't understand, Wendy. The light doesn't save you. It only delays the inevitable." I turned toward the shattered glass of the greenhouse wall, and there he was, standing just beyond the edge of the light. His form seemed almost transparent, flickering like a mirage, but his eyes burned with something dark and inhuman. "You can't escape Neverland," he snarled. "You are Neverland?" The word sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what he meant, but I couldn't stay to find out. Clutching the lamp tightly, I ran. I didn't care where, I just needed to get away from him, from the shadows, from all of it. The garden blurred around me as I sprinted, the light casting long, flickering beams that barely kept the darkness at bay. Behind me, I could still hear Peter's voice, distant but unrelenting, like it was chasing me through the night. "You'll come back, Wendy," he said. "They always do." I didn't stop running until my legs gave out, and even then, I kept crawling, dragging myself through the frozen earth. The lamp flickered in my hand, the flame threatening to go out with every gust of wind. Peter's voice still echoed in the distance, closer than it had any right to be. "You can't run from who you are," he taunted, the words sending spikes of fear through my chest. I didn't know where I was going anymore, only that I couldn't stop. Finally, I found myself at the edge of the property, near the old iron gate that hadn't been used in years. It was rusted shut, but I didn't care. I wedged the lamp into the dirt and threw myself against the gate, shaking it with all the strength I had left. The metal groaned, but didn't budge. Behind me, I could feel the shadows creeping closer again, the whispers returning like a wave building to crash. I grabbed the lamp and swung it wildly, the light forcing them back temporarily, but I knew it wouldn't last. And then I saw him, Peter, standing on the path just a few feet away, his face calm, but his eyes filled with fury. "You've forgotten," he said, his voice softer now, almost sad. "You were one of us once. You were happy, and now look at you, scrambling through the dirt, running from what you know to be true. This is where you belong, Wendy. It always has been." I pressed myself against the gate, my hands trembling so hard I could barely keep hold of the lamp. "I don't belong to you," I managed to choke out, though my voice sounded small, even to me. Peter tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You keep saying that," he said, taking a slow step closer. "But deep down, you know it isn't true. You left Neverland, but it never left you." The shadows surged forward again, circling Peter like a dark, pulsing tide. This time, they didn't seem to fear the light as much. I swung the lamp in their direction, but it only slowed them for a moment before they resumed their advance. Peter smiled, softly, almost kindly, and stretched out a hand. "It doesn't have to be this way," he said. "Come with me. I can make it all stop. The fear, the pain, the loneliness, you won't have to feel any of it again. Just let go." His words were like a pull, a whispering thread in my mind begging me to give in. And for a terrifying second, I almost did. But then I remembered my mother's face in the shadows, her silent scream, and the way Peter's voice had promised her the same lies. I gripped the lamp tighter, holding it up between us like a shield. "No," I said louder this time. "I'd rather grow old and die than be one of your shadows." Peter's smile faltered, just for a moment, and something dark flickered in his eyes. "So stubborn," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're better than the others? Stronger? You're not. You'll end up just like them." The shadows surged forward, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. I swung the lamp again, the light forcing them back, but they only regrouped, circling me like predators closing in for the kill. The gate rattled behind me as I threw my weight against it one last time. With a loud metallic groan, it gave way, the rusted hinges snapping under the force. I stumbled through, nearly dropping the lamp, and collapsed onto the frozen dirt outside. The shadows stopped abruptly at the threshold, writhing and pulsing as though some invisible barrier held them back. Peter stood just beyond the gate, his expression twisted with anger and something else. "Lost, maybe? You can't run from this, Wendy," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the night. "You think the world out there is any better? It'll chew you up, spit you out, and forget you ever existed. At least in Neverland you matter. Here you're nothing." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stood there, clutching the lamp, watching as the shadows began to fade and Peter's form grew more transparent, like smoke dissipating in the wind. "You'll come back," he said one last time, his voice softer now, almost like a promise. "They always do." And then he was gone. It's been hours since it happened, and I haven't been able to stop shaking. The house is quiet again. The shadows are gone, but I don't feel safe. I keep the lamp lit, afraid that if I let the flame die, they'll return. I try to tell myself it's over, that I escaped, but I can still hear Peter's voice in my head. "You'll come back." I don't know what he meant by that, but I'm terrified he's right. Maybe some part of me never left Neverland after all. I've lived in Vermont for as long as I can remember. I was born, grew up, and stayed here. And while it's a quiet place, it's also steeped in stories. The legend of Champ, the Lake Champlain monster, has always lingered in the background. Now, I never used to believe in that sort of thing. Legends, monsters, supernatural creatures, they all just seemed like exaggerated tales, or maybe even some kind of collective hallucination. But maybe I only thought that because I'd never actually experienced anything to prove otherwise. I've always been someone with a quiet life, a predictable routine, and a solid dose of skepticism. But that night, something inside me craved a different experience. I was stressed from work, and fishing alone seemed like the perfect way to unplug. So, I decided to head to Lake Champlain. I wasn't planning on catching anything big. I just wanted the quiet of the night and the sound of water around me. Still, as I prepared my gear, I couldn't help but think of all the times I'd heard stories about Champ. An aquatic creature, a sinuous shadow that some say resembles a plesiosaur. I'd seen the blurry photos floating around online and heard the impressive accounts from a few local residents, but I'd never taken any of it seriously. However, that night, as I loaded my gear into the car, a strange feeling crept over me, an unease that didn't match the warm summer night. It felt like something was trying to warn me, a subtle yet nagging sensation that wouldn't leave me alone. I brushed it off, even chuckling at myself for getting into the horror story mindset that I didn't even believe in. The lake was calm when I arrived. The dark sky, dotted with faint stars, felt like a heavy ceiling over the water, which oddly didn't reflect much light. Normally, it's a beautiful place, even inviting on clear nights, but tonight, Lake Champlain felt more profound. A vast, liquid darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. The uneasy feeling that had followed me only grew stronger as I set up my gear and prepared the boat. The trees around the lake stood eerily still, as if holding their breath, and not a single animal or insect dared to break the thick silence that draped over the place. I climbed into the boat, took the oars, and began rowing toward the center. Each stroke seemed to carry me further from any sense of safety. The only sound was the water splitting beneath the oar, the only sign of life in the middle of that vast emptiness. Yet, even there, surrounded by nothing but water and shadow, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I looked toward the shore, half expecting to see something or someone between the trees. But all I saw was silence, thick and dense, staring back at me. Then I stopped, floating in place. I let the oar rest at my side and took a deep breath. It was just a quiet night of fishing, I told myself. Time passed slowly as I waited for some sign of fish, some indication of activity in the lake. But instead, everything around me seemed frozen. The water was a perfect mirror, reflecting only the dark sky and a few stars. That's when I felt the first tremor beneath the boat. A slight touch, but unexpected, resonating through the hull. I looked around, but the water was still calm. Maybe a big fish, I thought, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. But seconds later, I heard a strange sound. It was distant, muffled, like something moving deep below me. The water around me formed small ripples, breaking the calm reflection on the surface. The waves gently rocked the boat, and I gripped the oars tightly, almost as if preparing for something. I looked around, searching for an explanation, but there was no wind, no animals, no other boats nearby. It was just me and that sound rising from the depths. I tightened my grip on the oars and tried to steady my breathing. As I waited for the silence to return, I noticed movement on the water surface. A shadow, long and indistinct, passed slowly, like an endless wave, directly beneath the boat. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. I sat motionless, watching that enormous shadow slide beneath me, a dark line moving through the depths. I couldn't see where it began or ended, but it was broad, much larger than any fish I'd ever seen in that lake. The boat rocked slightly. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could be just a water current, a floating log, or something else logical. But something inside me knew it wasn't any of that. It was something alive. I could feel it. The shadow vanished as quickly as it had appeared, like it had only surfaced to check me out before slipping back into the depths. I swallowed hard, still frozen, my eyes scanning the lake's surface, looking for any sign of what might be lurking down there. But now, the water was calm again, mirrored, as if nothing had happened. Silence returned, and all I could hear was my own heart hammering in my chest. For a brief moment, I thought about rowing back to shore. But just as the idea crossed my mind, I heard a sound, a low, cavernous growl, distant yet somehow far too close, echoing from the depths. That sound was enough to make me realize I wasn't alone. I was paralyzed, still clutching the oars, unable to move. The growl slowly faded, leaving an even thicker void in the air. Every part of me screamed to leave, to get out while I still could, but I was trapped, as if the lake itself held the boat in place, keeping me bound there. Then, suddenly, the water started moving again, this time with more force. Small waves, coming from a point ahead of me, spread until they gently lapped against the hull of the boat, making it sway slightly. It felt as if something enormous was approaching, something that made the water pulse, almost as if the lake itself was breathing. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the thought. But when I opened them again, I saw tiny ripples forming on the surface, expanding in circles around the boat. Every time I thought they'd disappear, another wave would appear, like something was slowly rising from the depths. Then the sound returned, closer this time, a deep vibration, a heavy groan, almost animal-like. The noise seemed to come from all around me, surrounding me, as if the whole lake was resonating with that sound. I could feel the tremor in the water, the boat's hull vibrating beneath my feet. Now, my survival instinct screamed inside me. Every muscle begged me to move the boat, but something in the lake's vastness held me there, trapped in that damp and suffocating darkness. And that's when I saw it. Not a vague shadow or a tremor in the water, but something real, tangible surfacing. A few yards away, the water began to break, as if a massive weight was rising from within the lake. First came the sound, a deep gurgling, bubbles bursting, water cascading. Then slowly, a dark, elongated form emerged, breaking the surface. It was a neck, a long, wet neck, arching awkwardly from the water like something that didn't belong to our time. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Its small head, with sunken, dark eyes, hovered several feet above the water, a nightmare bringing ancient legends to life. The creature just stood there, motionless, as if studying me. I couldn't move a muscle. It felt like my entire body was glued to the boat, like I was nothing more than an intruder in the presence of something ancient and unknown. Champ, the Lake Champlain monster, right there in front of me, breathing the same air I was. The stench of stagnant water, mixed with something decayed, hit my face, and nausea rose in my throat. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't tear my gaze from those dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Then, in a slow, silent motion, the creature began to retreat, submerging once more. The neck slipped back into the lake, vanishing without a sound, as if it had never been there. My heart was racing so fast that I could barely breathe. My eyes were still fixed on the spot where Champ had disappeared, but my mind was screaming that I needed to get out of there, that every second spent here was an invitation for that monster to come back. Trembling, I grabbed the oars with sweaty hands and started rowing toward the shore. Each stroke was frantic, uneven. I could barely feel my arms as I struggled to pull the boat away from that darkness. Yet, as I rowed, the water around me began to stir again. The previously calm surface now moved in gentle waves, ripples that seemed to follow me, growing stronger with each stroke. And that's when the feeling hit me again, the weight, the presence just below, like a gigantic shadow moving silently in the depths, tracking my every movement. My arms ached, but I couldn't stop. Every second, I felt like something was about to happen, like Champ was just waiting for the right moment to strike. The sound returned, the same low, resonant growl, a deep vibration that I could feel in my bones. The water around the boat rippled, and the hull groaned, as if a powerful current was passing right beneath, trying to drag me under. I kept rowing, my eyes fixed on the dark shore, which felt so far away. Each stroke was an act of desperation, a struggle against fear and exhaustion until, finally, I saw the outline of trees coming closer. I was almost there, but the terror continued to grip me, as if at any moment I would feel something grab the boat, dragging me into the depths. For some reason, though, it didn't happen. Finally, the boat slid through the water until it reached the shore, and I practically leaped out, stumbling as I tried to steady my feet on solid ground. My legs were shaking, adrenaline still rushing through my veins, but the sense of being on solid ground brought a brief, though incomplete, relief. Quickly, I turned back to look at the lake, expecting to see some sign of the creature, a ripple, anything to prove that what I experienced was real. But the lake was calm again. The dark waters remained still, reflecting only the night sky and a few scattered stars above. The surface looked strangely peaceful, as if nothing had happened, as if Champ had simply been a shadow that the lake swallowed back into its impenetrable silence. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands, but the air felt heavy, thick, and the smell of stagnant water still filled my lungs. I looked around, searching for reassurance in the familiar sight of the trees and the trail leading back to my car. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, like the monster's presence still hovered over me, hidden in the shadows of the trees or lurking in the lake's depths. With unsteady steps, I turned and started walking, leaving the lake behind. Each step seemed to pull me further from the terror. Yet something inside whispered that this experience would haunt me forever. That Champ, or whatever lay in that lake, would continue to haunt me even if I never returned. Back in my small apartment, exhausted and trying to rationalize what I'd seen, sleep eluded me. The image of that long neck and those dark, piercing eyes was etched into my brain, replaying every time I closed my eyes. Something inside me insisted that I needed to understand more about what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. Hours passed as I scoured everything I could find about Champ. I combed through forums, devoured eyewitness accounts, and watched dozens of blurry photos and videos that had once seemed like jokes. But now, as I analyzed them, I noticed a consistency I'd never paid attention to before. The oldest accounts shared disturbingly similar descriptions. A long-necked creature resembling ancient marine reptiles, always accompanied by an overwhelming sense of being watched. I learned that the legend of Champ wasn't new. The earliest reports came from Native Americans who believed in a lake serpent that protected those waters. Even the French explorer Samuel de Champlain, centuries ago, allegedly encountered a similar creature. His descriptions talked about a gigantic beast with a small, dark head that seemed to peer from the depths. The more I read, the faster my heart raced. It wasn't just the monster itself that terrified me. It was also the repeated sensations I had experienced. The strange silence, the feeling of being followed, the invisible weight of that presence. My encounter fit into something ancient, a haunting narrative that repeated itself, as though Champ wasn't just a creature, but a living, menacing part of the lake. The nights that followed were filled with torment. I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, a trick of my own mind, maybe fueled by exhaustion and the solitude of that night. But every time I closed my eyes, I relived the same scene. The dark lake, the creature emerging, and those cold eyes that seemed to study me. It felt as if, in some way, Champ was still there, even in the quiet of my bedroom. Strange dreams began to haunt me. I saw myself back at the lake, rowing desperately under a starless sky, surrounded by that same suffocating sensation. In each of those dreams, Champ was there, lurking beneath the surface, a persistent shadow watching me without ever fully revealing itself. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing, feeling as though the monster's presence was still around, even in waking moments. I started avoiding mirrors. Every time I looked, it was as if I could see something wrong in my own eyes, something the encounter with Champ had left behind, an invisible mark. The fear of being watched lingered, a discomfort that stayed with me even in the most mundane moments, as though the lake had taken a piece of my sanity. As the days passed, the terror rooted itself deeper, and I began to avoid solitary places where silence might remind me of that night. It felt as though, on some level, Champ was still there, haunting not only my dreams, but as a constant, cold shadow I'd brought back from the depths of the lake. With each passing week, I realized that the experience at the lake had altered something deep inside me. It was as if I had crossed an invisible line, a boundary between the known and the unknown. Before, I faced the world with skepticism, believing only in what I could see and touch. But now, something had shattered. The image of Champ, rising from the depths, grew more vivid with every memory, like a shadow I couldn't erase. I began to wonder if certain legends exist for a reason. Maybe they're warnings, reminders not to cross the boundaries of what we know. Lake Champlain seemed now like more than just a familiar landscape. It felt alive, ancient, and mysterious, as though it guarded secrets best left undiscovered. Champ wasn't just a monster, a figure from nightmares, but an embodiment of the lake itself, an extension of something that has inhabited those waters for centuries. I wondered how many others, like me, had been marked by that presence, carrying back home a fear that no one else could understand. Because deep down, I knew that even if I tried to share my experience, no one would fully grasp the truth. What happened that night was between me and the lake, and perhaps only those who had truly seen it could understand. In the end, I realized that some truths, like some monsters, are best left in the depths. I was never a man of blind faith. As a theology professor in the small town of Saint-Aubert, my approach had always been academic, rational. I studied religion, but I didn't live it. My world was made of books, debates, and theories, not miracles or divine visions. At least, that's what I believed until that night. It was autumn, a night of light rain and an overcast sky, and I was at home in my study grading student papers. I lived alone in an old house, an inheritance from my family, a quiet and predictable place, perfect for someone who spent his days buried in religious texts. Everything there was routine, monotonous until I felt it. First, it was the shift in the air, like something unseen had displaced the space around me. Then came the smell of ozone, that metallic scent that precedes a storm. A cold draft swept through the room, even though all the windows were shut. Strangely, I didn't feel fear at first, just a deep discomfort, as if something was watching me. And then I heard the whisper. Faint, brittle, like reality itself was trying to speak to me. When I turned to the window, I saw the silhouette. Too tall, unnaturally still, standing in the rain, staring straight at me. My stomach twisted, and something primal inside me screamed not to open the door. But my feet moved on their own. I unlatched the door before I could even think. The wood groaned as I pulled it open, and the cold night air rushed inside, carrying that metallic scent with it. The figure stood motionless just beyond the threshold. The porch light flickered, casting a weak glow over him. That's when I saw him properly. His face, if you could call it that, was disturbingly flawless. No blemishes, no pores, no imperfections. It was like a sculpture made of flesh, too symmetrical, too precise to be real. But his eyes, they were the worst part. Hollow, depthless, like staring into a void that stretched beyond time itself. He didn't step forward. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. And yet I understood what he wanted, what he needed. A feeling settled in my chest, a certainty that I couldn't explain. He was waiting for me to let him in. My hand tightened on the doorknob, my mind screaming that this was wrong, that I should close the door and pretend I never saw him. But my mouth betrayed me. "Come in," I said. My voice felt foreign, distant, like it wasn't even mine. He moved then, stepping over the threshold with a slow, deliberate grace. The lights in the house flickered again, buzzing with an almost living sound, and in that moment I knew I had just invited something into my home that was never meant to be here. As soon as he stepped inside, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew heavy, pressing against my skin like a thick, invisible fog. The house, my safe and predictable sanctuary, suddenly felt unfamiliar, like a place that no longer belonged to me. He stood in the doorway, silent, his wet clothes clinging to his unnaturally still frame. The rainwater on his skin didn't drip. It just clung to him, refusing to obey gravity. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "Who are you?" The words barely made it past my lips. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering how to answer. And then he spoke, not with his mouth, but inside my head. "My name is Azrael. I need your help." The voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a whisper, wasn't a sound at all. It was a presence, settling deep inside my mind, pushing into the corners of my thoughts. I staggered back, my breath hitching, as images flooded my head. Visions of an expanse of black, a vast sea of something that wasn't water, where pale, lifeless figures floated like corpses tangled in unseen threads. I felt my knees weaken as a single thought, not my own, surfaced within me. Heaven is not what you think it is. I gripped the edge of my desk to steady myself, my breathing shallow. The images, those pale bodies floating in darkness, lingered in my mind like an afterimage burned into my vision. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but the weight of his words, or thoughts, pressed down on me. Heaven is not what you think it is. Azrael took a slow step forward, and the floor didn't creak beneath his weight. It was as if he wasn't entirely here, like he existed on a plane just slightly removed from reality. My instincts screamed at me to run, to leave my own house if necessary. But some deeper, primal part of me knew that running wouldn't matter. He hadn't come here to hurt me. He had come because he was afraid. I don't understand, I managed to say, my voice hoarse. You're an angel? The word felt strange in my mouth, too small to describe what stood before me. Azrael exhaled, not a normal breath, but something that felt like the sigh of a collapsing world. Now I am something else. His thoughts slithered through my mind, unraveling more than just words. I saw glimpses of something vast, endless, incomprehensible. Not clouds, not golden gates, but a place where light didn't illuminate, it concealed. A place where the angels were not guardians, but wardens. And somewhere, buried within that radiance, was something older than God himself. I felt my stomach twist, a deep, nauseating unease creeping up my spine. This wasn't how angels were supposed to be. This wasn't the heaven I had spent my life studying. My entire career, my entire belief system. It all felt like a fragile illusion cracking before my eyes. Azrael took another step closer. The air around him shimmered like heat rising off pavement, but instead of warmth, it radiated a sickly cold that made my skin prickle. His voice, his thoughts, pressed deeper into my mind. I fled because I learned a name that should never be spoken, a name that should not exist. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls bending inward, suffocating. What name? I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the pounding in my skull. Azrael's expression remained unreadable, but something in him shifted, like even thinking about it caused him pain. His fingers twitched at his sides, and for the first time, I saw something close to fear in those abyss-like eyes. It is not a name in the way you understand. It is a sound, an absence, a wound carved into the foundation of all things. His presence pulsed, and I felt something scrape against my mind, something vast, something watching. My vision blurred, and suddenly I wasn't in my study anymore. I was there. I wasn't in my study. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. The world around me was vast and empty, a colorless expanse stretching in all directions. There was no sky, no ground, just a boundless void where space itself seemed uncertain. And in that void, suspended like puppets on invisible strings, were the angels. They were nothing like the depictions in art, nothing like the serene beings of Scripture. Their forms were twisted, elongated, their limbs stretching unnaturally, their faces featureless except for gaping, hollow eyes. Their wings, if they could even be called that, were not feathered, but skeletal, like charred remains of something once divine. They floated without moving, their bodies twitching as if struggling against unseen restraints. And from somewhere, though their mouths did not move, a sound emerged, a hollow, whispering drone. Neither prayer nor lament, but something in between. I wanted to turn away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. Something held me there, forcing me to see. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A shape, or rather the suggestion of one. It was too immense, too foreign for my mind to fully comprehend. It pulsed within the void, a shifting mass of darkness and fractured light, as if reality itself was breaking apart around it. The angels, those things were not guarding it. They were bound to it, tethered like prisoners, their bodies stretched thin as if their very existence was being unraveled. The longer I looked, the more I felt it looking back. It wasn't supposed to be seen. It wasn't supposed to be known. And yet, Somehow, Azrael had learned of its existence. That's why he fled. The moment I understood, I felt it see me. It wasn't like being watched. It was deeper than that, more invasive. It was as if my thoughts, my memories, everything that made me, had been cracked open, spilling into the void. I couldn't breathe. My mind throbbed with something wrong, a pressure that wasn't physical but existential, like my very presence in that place was an intrusion. Azrael's voice, or maybe it was just my own breaking sanity, whispered in my mind. You were never meant to know. None of us were. The shape in the void pulsed, shifting in a way that made my eyes ache. The angels, those grotesque, unraveling forms, trembled in their unseen bindings. And then, all at once, their heads turned toward me. Their mouths, previously frozen, empty, opened. A sound erupted from them, not a scream, not a word, but something in between. A warning, a curse, a command. I felt my mind tear. And then, I was back. I gasped, collapsing onto my study floor. My body convulsed as if I had been drowning, and only now broke the surface. The room was spinning, my vision blurring at the edges. My hands dug into the wooden floorboards, grounding myself in the reality that I had almost lost. Azrael stood over me, unmoving. His expression hadn't changed, but I could feel something radiating from him. Not triumph, not relief, something closer to sorrow. I forced myself to speak, my voice hoarse, broken. What was that? Azrael lowered his head slightly. That is what the angels guard. Not heaven, not paradise. A wound, a name, a thing that was buried in the firmament before time itself began. I swallowed hard, my body still trembling. And you learned its name? His gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw something truly human in him. Regret. I did, and now it knows me. A cold wave of realization washed over me. Azrael hadn't just fled to escape heaven. He had fled because it had seen him. And if it had seen me too, I wasn't safe. None of us were. I struggled to my feet, my body weak, my mind still reeling from what I had seen. The memory of that thing, the wound in existence, the prison buried beneath the illusion of heaven, clung to me like a sickness. I could still hear the sound the angels had made, that droning chorus of something between agony and devotion. Azrael stood in the dim light of my study, still as a statue, waiting. His presence no longer felt divine. It felt displaced, like something that had lost its place in the order of things, and now existed in a state of quiet dread. I forced my breath to steady. Why did you come to me? Because I cannot run alone. Azrael's voice murmured in my skull. The others, they will come for me. For you. They cannot allow what I know to remain free. A terrible understanding settled over me. The angels, those towering, unraveling things, were not just wardens of that buried entity. They were enforcers. If Azrael had escaped, if he had brought knowledge of it to the mortal world, then something would come to silence him, to silence both of us. I felt the weight of it settle in my bones. There was no turning back. I had been seen, and now, whether I wanted it or not, I was part of this. A deep, low vibration passed through the house, rattling the windows. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sound was wrong. It didn't roll, didn't fade. It was steady, building like a note sustained by something too large to be real. Azrael turned his head sharply toward the front door. His expression darkened. They are here. I barely had time to react before the lights went out, plunging the house into darkness. The steady hum grew louder, vibrating the very air, pressing into my chest like a physical force. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering. Outside, beyond the windows, the street lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the pavement. And then I saw them, tall, thin figures moving without motion. Their bodies shifted rather than stepped, gliding forward in the rain. Their forms were human only in suggestion, silhouettes too long. their faces featureless except for the gleam of hollow, hungry eyes. The angels had come. My breath caught in my throat. I had spent my life studying angels, reading their descriptions in scripture, debating their nature in lecture halls. But nothing had prepared me for this. They stood motionless outside, their elongated forms barely visible in the flickering streetlights. The rain fell through them as if they weren't fully here, as if their existence flickered between realities. Their eyes, if they could even be called that, were not set in faces but in the absence of faces, hollow voids that gleamed with something hungry. Azrael stepped forward, his presence shifting, becoming something more solid. His wings, no longer luminous but frayed, unraveling at the edges, stretched slightly, a reflex of an animal sensing a predator. "Do not move," his voice pressed into my mind. "Do not make a sound." The humming intensified, vibrating in my chest and my teeth. My knees locked, my body refusing to obey my instinct to run. One of the figures tilted its head, a slow, unnatural motion, as if listening for something just beyond hearing. And then it stepped forward, not gliding like before, but stepping, its elongated limb touching the ground with deliberate weight. The air around it warped, the rain bending unnaturally in its presence. I felt something shift deep inside my skull, a pressure, a pulling sensation, like my mind was being drawn toward it. Azrael exhaled slowly. "They are not here for a conversation." A deep crack sounded through the house, with splitting metal groaning. My front door was pulled inward, bending as if an unseen force was peeling it apart. I staggered backward, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. "Jesus Christ!" Azrael's gaze snapped to me. "Do not invoke his name. Not now." The air collapsed. The walls of my house breathed, warping inward as if something far larger than the space itself was trying to enter. The angels outside did not move, but I felt them pressing closer, their collective gaze boring into me. Azrael moved then, his wings unfurling fully, his form glowing with a light that wasn't light but absence, an inversion of radiance that made my skin crawl. "You must choose, Elias." His voice was no longer a whisper, but a command. "Run, and they will hunt you. Stay, and you will not survive. But if you come with me..." The house shattered. The door exploded inward, splinters of wood flying in all directions. A force like an invisible tidal wave slammed into me, sending me sprawling across the floor. My ears rang, my vision blurred. And then, through the broken threshold, the angels stepped inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, everything changed. The air inside my house broke. That's the only way I can describe it. The walls warped, stretching and twisting as if the space itself was rejecting their presence. The light, what little remained, seemed to pull away from them, sucked into the void of their forms. My skin prickled with something primal, a sensation beyond fear, beyond reason. My body knew before my mind could process it. These were not messengers of God. There was something else. Azrael moved before I could even react. His form blurred, his unraveling wings spreading wide as he pushed against something unseen. A sound split the air, a deep, resonant crack, like the sky itself had fractured. The angels hesitated for a fraction of a second, their hollow eyes shifting toward him. "Run, Elias." His voice in my mind was no longer calm. It was urgent, desperate, but my body wouldn't move. One of the angels, or whatever they were, lifted an arm, its limbs stretching unnaturally, elongating like a shadow cast by something unseen. The space between us folded, and suddenly, it was inches away from me. A cold hand, if it could even be called a hand, gripped my forehead. The moment it touched me, my mind split open. I was nowhere. I was everywhere. I saw a city of blinding white light, not built, but grown, its structures shifting, pulsing as if alive. I saw angels, not like Azrael, Not like the grotesque figures before me, but beings of raw, incomprehensible form. And in the heart of that city, beneath a sky that was not sky, but an expanse of infinite nothingness, I saw it. The wound in existence. The thing that was never meant to be known. And I understood this was never about heaven or hell. It was never about good or evil. It was about something before all of that. Something buried. Something even the angels feared. And now it knew me. I came back to myself with a choked scream. The angel's hand was still on my forehead, pressing, pulling. My vision blurred. My body convulsing as I felt myself being taken, pulled into something I couldn't comprehend. Then Azrael moved. There was no sound, no flash of light, just motion, faster than my mind could register. He tore the angel away from me, his wings unraveling further, strands of something not quite light peeling from his form. The angel recoiled, its faceless head twisting in an unnatural arc. Azrael's voice was in my mind again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Close your eyes. Do not look. Do not think. Just run. I obeyed. I turned and ran. The house behind me collapsed, not in fire, not in destruction, but in absence. One moment it was there, the next it simply wasn't. A void in its place, a piece of reality erased. I didn't stop running. I didn't turn back. The street outside was wrong, shifting, bending in ways it shouldn't. Shadows stretched in impossible directions. The streetlights flickered between colors I couldn't name. Azrael was beside me, his form flickering, barely holding together. We are not safe yet. I gasped for breath, my body shaking, my mind barely clinging to reason. Where are we going? He didn't answer immediately. He just kept running, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, his voice pressed into my mind, softer this time. Somewhere they won't follow. Somewhere beyond their reach. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving. Where? Azrael looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something close to doubt in his gaze. I don't know. And then, the world around us changed. The street, the sky, the city, everything blurred, folding inward like a collapsing piece of paper. My stomach lurched as gravity twisted, and for a single, horrifying moment, I felt myself falling. Not down, not up, but out. And then, nothing. I don't know where I am now. I don't know when I am. The sky here is wrong. The air is too still. There is no sound except my own breath and Azrael's quiet, unreadable presence beside me. I don't think we escaped. I think we just ran out of places to run. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily, but what happened in the summer of 1998 in Ashwood still gives me chills. It was during the annual Harvest Festival, an event my family loved to attend every year. My parents, my older sister Emily, and I decided to take some pictures at the old Wheatley farm, a place straight out of a postcard with red barns and golden fields. Everything felt normal that afternoon. The sun was bright, kids were running around, and the smell of roasted corn filled the air. My mom insisted we get a photo in front of the main barn. A couple passing by offered to take it for us, so we all lined up and smiled for the camera. But right as the flash went off, Emily suddenly stiffened. She said she felt an icy chill, which was weird because the day was scorching hot. I laughed it off, thinking she was just imagining things. A few days later, my mom picked up the developed photos from the local market. We all sat around the kitchen table, flipping through them together. At first, everything looked normal. Smiling faces, scenic fields, and the usual festival cheer. But then we got to that one picture. At first glance, it seemed fine, but Emily was the first to point it out. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice shaky, as she pointed to the background. There, just off to the side of the barn, was a man none of us recognized. He was tall, with an unnervingly pale face and dead, vacant eyes that seemed to pierce through the photo. His clothes were what really stood out, completely out of place. He wore a dark suit, a wide-brimmed hat, and a stiff, old-fashioned collar that looked like something from the early 1900s. At first, we thought it had to be someone from the festival who happened to walk by. But the more we looked at the picture, the stranger it felt. No one remembered seeing him that day. The area where he stood wasn't crowded. It was near the side of the barn, and we would have noticed someone standing there. My dad even joked, maybe he's a ghost from the old days, but his laugh didn't last long. The man's expression was what got to us. His face wasn't just blank. It was wrong, like there was nothing behind those eyes. I couldn't stop staring at him, feeling a weird sense of unease, like he was staring back at me through the photo. Emily started acting weird after that. She kept saying she didn't feel right, that something about the picture was off. She wouldn't let it go, and that night, she brought it up again while we were all sitting in the living room. She told us she'd felt something strange when the photo was taken, like someone was watching us. It wasn't just a chill, she said. It felt like something was standing right behind me. My mom told her she was overthinking it, but I could tell Emily wasn't convinced. To be honest, neither was I. Something about that photo felt wrong, like it wasn't just a random photo bomb. The next morning, Emily insisted on taking the photo to school to show her history teacher. She said maybe he'd know something about the man's clothes, or if there had been any reenactments at the festival. I didn't think much of it until she came home later, pale as a sheet. She dropped her bag at the door and went straight to her room without saying a word. My mom followed her, and I overheard Emily whispering something about how the teacher thought the clothes were from the early 1900s, maybe 1910 or 1911, and that they didn't match anything people would wear today, not even for a costume. That night, she refused to sleep alone, so she camped out on the floor in my room. It felt like she didn't want to be by herself, but she wouldn't talk about it anymore. A few days later, the uneasiness around the photo got worse. My mom had left it out on the kitchen counter, and as I was grabbing a snack, I took another look at it. That's when I noticed something that nearly made me drop my plate. The man wasn't in the same spot anymore. In the original photo, he'd been standing near the barn a good 10 feet behind us. But now he was closer, still blurry, but noticeably closer, as if he'd taken a few steps forward. I yelled for my mom, and she came rushing in, followed by Emily and my dad. At first, they thought I was messing with them, but when we compared the photo to how we remembered it, everyone went silent. Emily started crying, saying, "I told you something's wrong." That night, none of us could sleep. The photo sat on the kitchen table like some cursed artifact, and no one dared to touch it. My dad tried to come up with a rational explanation, saying maybe the photo lab had mixed up images or that it was just a weird double exposure. But deep down, I think we all knew that wasn't true. I couldn't stop picturing that pale face, those dead eyes, and the way he seemed to be moving closer, like he was trying to reach us. Emily kept pacing around, saying she felt like the man was still watching her. Mom tried to calm her down, but she wasn't exactly calm herself. She kept checking the locks on the doors and windows, as if that would somehow keep a man in a photo from getting inside. The next day, Emily decided to dig into it. She went to the local library and started searching through old newspapers and archives. She came back with a folder full of photocopies and a look on her face that sent a chill down my spine. She sat us all down in the living room and spread out the papers on the coffee table. There, in an old black and white photo from 1911, was the same man, same pale face, same dead eyes, same outdated clothes. He'd been a suspect in a series of gruesome murders in Ashwood over a century ago. According to the article, his name was Albert Gaines, and he was accused of killing 5 people, all from the same family, before vanishing without a trace. Emily pointed out the eerie coincidence. The victims in the story looked disturbingly similar to us. She said, "It's like he's coming back to finish what he started." That evening, the tension in our house was unbearable. My dad tried to brush it all off, saying it was just a bizarre coincidence, but he couldn't hide how shaken he was. Emily wasn't letting it go. She kept flipping through the articles, reading them out loud. Albert Gaines had disappeared before his trial, and some rumors claimed he'd cursed the land where his crimes took place. "It's probably just old folklore," my mom muttered, but her voice wavered. Emily wasn't buying it. "He's in the photo, Mom. It's him. How do you explain that?" No one had an answer. That night, we decided to lock the photo in a drawer, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. It didn't work. The next morning, things got worse. My mom was the first to notice. She opened the drawer to get the photo, and when she pulled it out, the man had moved again. This time, he wasn't just closer. He was standing directly behind us in the photo, almost as if he was part of our family. His face was clearer now, and his expression had changed. Before, he looked blank, lifeless. Now, there was something else, something like a cruel smirk that made my stomach turn. Mom screamed and dropped the picture, and that's when we all saw it. It wasn't just a photo anymore. The air in the room grew cold, and there was this feeling, this oppressive weight, like someone was standing there with us. Emily started crying, saying she could feel him watching us. I felt it too, like his eyes were boring into me from every corner of the room. By that point, we knew something was horribly wrong. My dad, who had been trying to stay rational, finally snapped. He grabbed the photo, marched out to the backyard, and tossed it into the fire pit. We all watched as he lit a match and dropped it in. The flames roared to life, and for a second, I felt relief. But then Emily screamed. "It's not burning," she cried. She was right. The edges of the photo curled a little, but the image itself remained intact, as if the fire couldn't touch it. My dad pulled it out with a stick and just stared at it, his hands shaking. None of us said a word as he threw it back into the drawer, slammed it shut, and locked it. That night, I woke up to a sound I'll never forget. Emily screaming at the top of her lungs. I bolted out of bed and ran to her room. She was sitting upright, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "He was here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was standing in the corner, just staring at me." My parents rushed in, and we all searched the room, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. Emily refused to go back to her room after that. She spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with all the lights on, clutching a blanket like it was the only thing keeping her safe. None of us slept. The following morning, Emily was adamant that we had to leave the house. "He's not just in the photo anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "He's here." My parents were hesitant, thinking it might just be her nerves getting the best of her, but then weird things started happening. Doors we knew we'd locked were suddenly wide open. The lights flickered constantly, even in broad daylight. And the worst part? We all started hearing footsteps at odd hours of the night. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing through the house. My dad tried to blame it on old pipes or creaky floors, but deep down, I think he knew better. We all did. Emily kept digging into the history of Albert Gaines. She found more unsettling details. His victims had all described a sense of being watched in the days leading up to their deaths. One account from an old journal even mentioned seeing him in reflections or out of the corner of their eye before he finally came for them. "It's like he plays with them first," Emily whispered as she read the words aloud. By now, my mom was beyond scared. She started calling around for help, priests, paranormal investigators, anyone who might know what to do. Most people either didn't believe her or told her they couldn't help. The few who seemed interested warned her about trying to get rid of him. "Sometimes, acknowledging something like this only makes it stronger," one woman told her. That was when I realized we were on our own. That night was the worst yet. We all decided to sleep in the living room, thinking it would feel safer if we were together. My dad brought down a bat like that would help against whatever this was. Around 2 a.m., the temperature in the room dropped sharply. It was freezing, like we'd stepped into a walk-in freezer, even though it was the middle of August. Emily grabbed my arm and pointed to the window. "Do you see him?" she whispered. I looked where she was pointing, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing just outside the glass, was the man from the photo. He was closer than ever, his pale face almost pressed against the pane. His dead eyes locked onto us, and that cruel smirk was wider now, like he was enjoying this. My dad jumped up and ran to the window, but by the time he threw it open, the man was gone. Not a single trace of him outside, not even footprints in the dirt. That's when we heard it. A slow, deliberate knock at the front door. 3 heavy thuds, like someone pounding with their fist. My mom screamed, and my dad yelled, "Who's there?" But there was no answer, just silence. We didn't open the door. None of us wanted to know what was on the other side. Instead, we all huddled together in the center of the room, too terrified to move. The knocking didn't come again, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It clung to the air, heavy and suffocating, like he was still there waiting. The next morning, we were all on edge. None of us had slept, and the house felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. My dad decided we needed to leave, even if just for a day, to clear our heads. We packed a few things and drove to my aunt's house 2 towns over. The whole drive, Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, like she was expecting to see him following us. My mom tried to reassure her, but I could tell she didn't believe her own words. When we finally got to my aunt's, I felt a small sense of relief. The house was bright and lively, the complete opposite of the suffocating darkness we'd left behind. But the peace didn't last long. That evening, as we were sitting around the table for dinner, my aunt asked about the festival and whether we'd taken any good pictures. My mom froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Emily just stared down at her plate. My dad tried to change the subject, but my aunt wouldn't let it go. "Come on, you must have taken at least one good family photo," she said with a laugh. My mom finally gave in and pulled the picture out of her purse. She'd brought it, hoping to show it to someone who might help. The moment my aunt saw it, her face went pale. "That man," she whispered. "I've seen him before." We all stared at her, stunned, as she pointed to the figure in the photo. "He used to live here. My mom used to tell me stories about him when I was a kid. Horrible stories." My aunt's words hit like a gut punch. "What do you mean he lived here?" my dad asked, his voice tense. My aunt hesitated, looking like she was debating whether to even tell us. "His name was Albert Gaines," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was a tenant on a farm just outside Ashwood back in the early 1900s. People said he did horrible things to his neighbors." She glanced at Emily and me, as if deciding how much to share. "My mom told me he killed a whole family, children included, and then he vanished, just like that. But some people swore they'd still see him, watching them from the woods or appearing in reflections." Emily was shaking. "He's not just in reflections," she said. "He's in the photo, and he's getting closer." My aunt looked at the picture again, her face twisting in horror. "You need to get rid of it," she said firmly. My dad explained how we tried burning it, and it wouldn't destroy. "Then you need help," my aunt said, standing up and pacing the room. "There's a man in town who deals with things like this. People say he's crazy, but he might be your best shot." She wrote down a name and an address and told us to go first thing in the morning. None of us wanted to wait, but the idea of driving at night while that thing might be following us was too much. The next day, we drove to the man's house. It was a ramshackle cabin on the edge of a thick forest. The man, who introduced himself as Henry, didn't seem surprised when we showed him the photo. In fact, he looked almost resigned. "You've seen him," he said simply, pointing at the pale figure. He told us he'd heard stories about Albert Gaines his whole life, about how he wasn't just a man, but something worse, something that lingered, feeding off fear. "He's attached to your family now," Henry said, matter-of-factly. "He'll keep coming closer until he gets what he wants." My mom asked what we could do to stop him, but Henry just shook his head. "It's not that simple. The more you fight, the stronger he gets." Henry's words left us stunned. "So, what are we supposed to do? Just let him take us?" My dad snapped, his voice filled with frustration and fear. Henry stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You don't have much time," he said. "Once he's close enough, he'll cross over." Emily asked what that meant, and Henry hesitated before explaining. "He'll stop being confined to the photo. He'll be here, in your world. And once that happens," he trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. We all understood. Henry handed my dad a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a jar of black powder and a scrap of paper covered in symbols. "Burn this where the photo was taken," he said. "It might sever the connection." But if it doesn't, he looked at us, his face grim. "Run." We didn't waste time. By the afternoon, we were back at the Wheatley farm, standing near the old barn where the picture was taken. The place felt different now, silent, like even the wind didn't dare move. My dad spread the black powder in a circle and placed the photo in the center. Emily held the paper with the symbols, her hands shaking as she read the words out loud. The moment she started, the air grew heavy, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on us. The photo in the circle began to darken, as if the figure in it was fading. For a second, I thought it was working, but then we heard it, a low, guttural laugh, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The laugh grew louder, echoing around us, and then the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air as a shadow began to form just outside the circle. It stretched and twisted, taking shape, and before we could react, he was there. The man from the photo, Albert Gaines. He looked even worse in person. His skin was so pale it almost seemed translucent, and his eyes were black pits, like staring into a void. He stepped closer to the edge of the circle, his twisted smirk never leaving his face. "You can't stop me," he rasped, his voice like nails on glass. Emily froze, clutching the paper, unable to keep reading. My dad yelled at her to finish, but she couldn't move. The moment Emily stopped reading, the circle of black powder began to break apart, scattering as if caught by an invisible wind. Albert stepped closer, his movements slow but deliberate, like he was savoring every second of our fear. My dad lunged forward, trying to redraw the circle, but the powder wouldn't stay. It was like something was sweeping it away as soon as it touched the ground. Albert's smirk widened, and his eyes locked onto Emily. "She called me here," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "She's the one I want." Emily let out a scream and bolted toward the car. My dad grabbed my mom and me, yelling for us to follow. As we ran, I dared to look back. Albert was still standing by the barn, but he wasn't just watching anymore. He was starting to move. It was subtle at first, like his image was flickering between the barn and the space closer to us. Every time I blinked, he seemed a little nearer. By the time we reached the car, I swear I could feel his breath on my neck. We scrambled inside, and my dad floored it, tearing down the dirt road as fast as he could. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like he was still with us, even though I couldn't see him anymore. Back at my aunt's house, we locked every door and window, but it didn't matter. The heaviness in the air was back, worse than before. Emily couldn't stop crying, and my mom was pacing the room, clutching a rosary she hadn't touched in years. My dad sat silently at the table, staring at the empty photo frame we'd brought with us. The photo was gone. Somehow, during the chaos, it had vanished. "He doesn't need it anymore," Emily whispered, her voice hollow. "He's here now." That night, none of us slept. The house creaked and groaned like it was alive, and every shadow seemed to move. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I got up to check, there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Around 3 a.m., the lights in the house flickered and went out completely. We all huddled together in the living room, too scared to move, and then we heard it, the same deliberate, heavy knocking, this time coming from inside the house. The knocking started slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, echoing through the darkened house. We clung to each other, frozen in fear. "It's coming from upstairs," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us wanted to check, but the sound was relentless, moving closer with each knock. My dad, trying to be brave, grabbed the bat he'd brought from home and motioned for us to stay put. He climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood making my stomach churn. We waited in silence, the air thick with dread. Then we heard him shout, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. We rushed to the staircase and found my dad at the top, pale and trembling. He didn't say a word, just pointed to Emily's room. When we looked inside, the photo was there sitting on her bed. Only now it was completely different. The image of us in front of the barn was gone, replaced by a single figure, Albert Gaines. He was staring directly at the camera, his smirk wider than ever, his hand raised as if beckoning us. My mom gasped, covering her mouth, while Emily started to cry. "He's in the house," she whispered. "He's already here." That's when the real horror began. The house seemed to come alive, the walls groaning and the temperature plummeting. The shadows grew darker, stretching across the floor like long, grasping fingers. The lights flickered back on for a moment, but they weren't a relief. In the brief flashes of brightness, I could see him, Albert, standing in the corner of the room, just watching us. His body didn't move, but his head tilted ever so slightly, like he was studying us. Then the lights went out again, and the knocking resumed, this time coming from all around us. My dad yelled for us to get out of the house, and we didn't hesitate. We ran out into the night, the cold air hitting us like a slap. But even outside, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. We piled into the car and sped off, not knowing where to go. My dad drove aimlessly, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We can't go back," Emily kept muttering. "He's never going to stop." She was right. Even as we left Ashwood behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that Albert wasn't done with us. He didn't need the house, the photo, or even the barn anymore. Somehow, I knew he was still with us, waiting for the moment to finish what he'd started over a century ago. We drove for hours, well past midnight, until we finally pulled into an empty motel parking lot in a neighboring town. My dad paid for a room in cash, not wanting to explain why his entire family looked like they'd seen a ghost. Inside, we locked the door, pushed furniture against it, and sat together in silence. None of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we all felt the same thing. He was still with us. The room was stale and dimly lit, but it didn't matter. The sense of being watched followed us, clinging to our skin like smoke. Emily wouldn't stop shaking, and my mom sat beside her, whispering prayers under her breath. Around 3 a.m., Emily gasped and shot to her feet. "He's here," she cried, pointing to the mirror above the sink. At first, I didn't see anything, but as I stared, my blood ran cold. There, faint but unmistakable, was Albert's face reflected in the glass. His expression was twisted, almost gleeful, as if he was feeding off our fear. My dad grabbed a towel and threw it over the mirror, but it didn't help. The room grew colder, and a faint scratching sound started coming from the walls, like nails dragging over wood. Emily clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "He's not just watching anymore," she whispered. "He's trying to come through." We couldn't stay there. My dad made the call to leave, even though we had no idea where we'd go. As we packed up, the scratches grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way inside. Then the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. In the silence, we heard it again, the deliberate, heavy knocking, this time on the motel door. My dad yelled for us to stay back as he approached it, but before he could reach the handle, the knocking stopped. Instead, the door began to creak open on its own, even though we'd locked it and barricaded it with a chair. My dad froze, staring into the hallway. It was empty, but the shadows seemed alive, twisting unnaturally. That's when we saw him, Albert, standing at the far end of the hall, his figure barely illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lights. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at us, his smirk more menacing than ever. My mom screamed, and my dad slammed the door shut, shoving the chair back into place. "We need to go," he shouted, and we didn't argue. We ran to the car, piling in as fast as we could, and drove into the night, leaving the motel and whatever nightmare was unfolding there behind. We drove in silence, the highway stretching endlessly in front of us. No one spoke. It felt like words would only make things worse. Emily sat in the back seat, staring out the window, her face pale and expressionless. My mom kept clutching her rosary, whispering prayers under her breath. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Albert sitting in the back seat or walking along the empty road behind us. Every shadow felt alive, every flicker of movement a threat. Eventually, we pulled into a 24-hour diner, desperate for a moment of normalcy, or at least somewhere with people. The place was nearly empty, just a waitress behind the counter and an old man sipping coffee in a corner booth. We took a table near the window, and for the first time in hours, it felt like we could breathe again. My dad ordered coffee for himself and hot chocolate for Emily and me. The waitress smiled and asked if we were traveling, but my dad just shook his head, too tired to explain. For a moment, the warmth of the diner almost made us feel safe. Almost. But then Emily froze. She was staring at something over my shoulder, her face draining of color. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Turning slowly, I scanned the room, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the old man in the corner, the waitress behind the counter, and the faint hum of the jukebox. But then I saw it. Outside the diner, standing just beyond the glass, was Albert. His pale face was illuminated by the flickering neon sign, his black, empty eyes locked onto us. He wasn't smirking anymore. His expression was darker, angrier, like he was done playing games. Emily started shaking, tears streaming down her face. "He's going to get us," she sobbed. My dad jumped up, grabbing the car keys, and motioned for us to leave. But when we stood, the lights in the diner flickered and dimmed. The waitress stopped mid-sentence, her smile fading as she glanced toward the window. "What the hell is that?" she muttered, taking a step back. Even the old man in the corner looked uneasy, his coffee cup trembling in his hand. We didn't answer the waitress. My dad grabbed Emily's arm, practically dragging her toward the door, and my mom and I followed close behind. But the moment we stepped outside, the air felt thick, heavy, like trying to breathe through water. The parking lot was eerily silent, except for the soft hum of the diner's neon sign. Albert was gone, or at least we thought he was. We sprinted to the car, my dad fumbling with the keys as we all piled in. The second the doors locked, the windshield fogged over. It wasn't condensation. It was words written in long, jagged streaks. "You can't run," Emily screamed, and my mom started crying, clutching her rosary tighter. My dad didn't waste time. He threw the car into gear and sped out of the lot, tires screeching. The fog on the windshield cleared almost instantly, but the words were burned into my mind. "He's never going to stop," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. None of us argued. We knew she was right. My dad kept driving, turning onto back roads and side streets, trying to lose whatever it was that was chasing us. But no matter how far we went, the feeling stayed. Albert was still with us, lingering just out of sight. At some point, the car stalled. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. My dad cursed, banging his fists on the steering wheel, while my mom begged him to stay calm. Emily was shaking so badly, I thought she might pass out. "He's here," she whispered, barely audible. And then we heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the woods. My dad turned the key, desperate to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The footsteps got louder, closer, until they were right outside the car. I couldn't bring myself to look, but Emily did. Her scream was so raw, so filled with terror, it sent chills down my spine. "He's right there," she cried, pointing to the passenger side window. And there he was, Albert, standing inches from the glass, his pale face even more horrifying up close. His eyes were black holes, and his mouth twisted into that cruel, knowing smirk. He raised a hand and tapped the glass, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. My dad yelled at us to close our eyes, to not look at him, but it was impossible. The car filled with that oppressive, icy cold again, and I knew, deep down, that there was nowhere left to run. We sat there, frozen, as Albert's pale face loomed outside the window. His tapping grew louder, sharper, like he was testing the glass. My dad kept turning the key, his knuckles white and trembling, but the engine refused to start. Emily was sobbing uncontrollably, curled into the smallest ball she could manage. My mom started praying aloud, her words trembling and frantic. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Albert's face. His smirk seemed to widen, his head tilting ever so slightly, as if he could hear her prayers and was mocking them. Then, with a sudden burst, the windshield cracked. It wasn't shattered completely, but long, jagged lines spidered across the glass, making Albert's distorted face look even more horrifying. "Get out!" "Now," my dad shouted, throwing the driver's side door open. We didn't hesitate. We scrambled out of the car, the cold night air hitting us like a slap. Albert didn't follow. He just stood there, watching us through the broken windshield. But I could feel it. He was letting us go, toying with us, as if he knew we had nowhere safe to run. We ran blindly into the woods, the darkness swallowing us whole. The trees were thick and tangled, their branches clawing at our clothes as we stumbled forward. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, convinced Albert was right behind us. Emily was panting hard, her sobs muffled by her own gasping breaths. My dad led the way, holding onto my mom's hand tightly, while I stayed close to Emily, tried to keep her moving. But no matter how far we ran, the feeling didn't fade. He was still there, lurking just out of sight, his presence pressing down on us like a weight we couldn't escape. Then we came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. The old barn. The same one from the photo. My dad stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale as a ghost. "This isn't possible," he whispered. We'd driven miles, taken random turns, and run through unfamiliar woods, but somehow, we were right back where it all started. The barn loomed in the moonlight, its red paint peeling and its roof sagging under the weight of time. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness inside, was Albert. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there waiting. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. The barn stood there like a monument to everything we'd been trying to escape. My dad whispered, "It's like he's pulling us back," but no one responded. Albert hadn't moved, but the weight of his presence was unbearable, as if the air around us was thick with something malevolent. My mom gripped my dad's arm and whispered it desperate, "What do we do?" But before he could answer, Albert stepped forward. Just one step, but it was enough to send Emily into a full-blown panic. "We can't go back there," she cried, clawing at me as if trying to hold herself in place. My dad made a split-second decision. "Run," he shouted, pushing us back toward the trees. But the moment we turned, we saw them, shadows moving between the trees. They weren't solid, more like flickering shapes, but they were everywhere, blocking every path. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, and quick, and every time one flickered closer, the air grew colder. "He's hurting us," my dad said, his voice shaking. Albert hadn't left the doorway of the barn, but we could feel his control. He didn't need to chase us. He was guiding us, forcing us toward him. Left with no choice, we moved toward the barn, every step feeling like we were sealing our fate. As we got closer, the world seemed to distort. The air felt thicker, and the barn didn't look real anymore. Its edges blurred, the colors too vivid, like we were stepping into a different reality. Albert disappeared into the shadows of the doorway, but we knew he was waiting inside. My dad held up his hand, signaling for us to stop. "Stay behind me," he said, though his voice wavered. We huddled together, trembling as we crossed the threshold. Inside, the barn was suffocatingly dark. The smell of damp wood and decay filled my nose, and I could barely see my own hands in front of me. But then, one by one, lanterns hanging from the rafters flared to life. Their dim light revealed the same man from the photo, standing at the center of the barn. Only now, he wasn't a blurred figure in the background. He was flesh and blood, and more terrifying than I'd imagined. His pale skin seemed to glow in the lantern light, and his smirk had turned into something far worse, a wide, twisted grin that stretched unnaturally across his face. Albert stood motionless in the center of the barn, but his presence filled every corner. It wasn't just his face or his unnaturally stretched grin. It was the way the air felt, thick with malice, as if the barn itself was alive and feeding off our fear. None of us dared move. My dad was breathing heavily, his fists clenched, trying to keep himself together. Emily whimpered, her nails digging into my arm. Albert didn't speak, didn't lunge. He just tilted his head slightly, like a predator deciding when to strike. Then, in a voice that sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere, he finally broke the silence. "You can't leave," he said, his words slow and deliberate, each syllable dripping with cruel amusement. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the barn, vibrating through my chest. "This isn't your world anymore. It's mine." The lanterns above us flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. My mom started praying again, clutching her rosary so tightly that her knuckles turned white. But Albert just laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my stomach churn. "Prayers won't save you," he sneered. "Nothing will." Then the barn began to change. The wooden beams twisted and groaned, warping like something alive. The floorboards beneath us creaked and shifted, and I swore I saw faces in the grain of the wood, twisted, screaming faces, their mouths open in silent agony. Emily screamed, clutching my dad as the shadows on the walls grew darker, more solid, until they began stepping forward. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were figures, humanoid but distorted, with elongated limbs and hollow faces. They surrounded us, closing in slowly, their movements synchronized, as if they were all controlled by the same unseen force. Albert raised a hand, and the figures stopped, their heads snapping toward him in unison. His grin widened, and he took a step forward. "It's time," he said, his voice cold and final. My dad grabbed the black powder from his pocket, the last of what Henry had given us, and hurled it at Albert. The powder burst into the air, filling the barn with a sharp, acrid smell. Albert recoiled, his grin faltering for the first time, and the shadows seemed to shrink back. "Go," my dad yelled, pushing us toward the door. "Run!" We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the door, the warped wood creaking and groaning beneath our feet. The shadows writhed and lunged as we ran, their hollow faces twisting in silent rage, but they hesitated, as if the powder had created a temporary barrier. Albert's furious scream echoed through the barn, shaking the walls and sending a cold, stabbing pain through my ears. "You can't escape," he roared, his voice no longer human, but a guttural snarl that made my stomach churn. We burst out into the open air, but the relief was short-lived. The barn was no longer the place we had arrived at. It was surrounded by a dense, impenetrable fog that seemed to pulse and breathe like it was alive. My dad grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward the car, which was somehow back in front of the barn despite being left miles away. The logic of the world around us was breaking down, twisting into something incomprehensible. My mom screamed, "Don't stop! Don't look back!" But I couldn't help it. For a split second, I turned. Albert was standing in the doorway of the barn, his body glowing faintly in the fog. His grin was gone, replaced with something worse, pure, unfiltered rage. He raised both hands, and the shadows that had been inside the barn surged out, spilling into the fog like a living tide. They were faster now, relentless, and closing the distance between us. My dad threw open the car doors, yelling for us to get inside. I barely managed to slam the door shut before the first shadow reached the car. It slammed against the window, its hollow face inches from mine, its empty mouth stretching wide in a silent scream. The engine roared to life, and my dad floored it, the car lurching forward as the shadows swarmed around us. The fog made it impossible to see, but my dad didn't slow down. "Just keep going," my mom cried, her voice breaking. Emily was sobbing uncontrollably in the back seat, and I couldn't even think. I just kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, where Albert's figure was still visible, standing motionless in the fog, watching us. The shadows didn't stop, though. They chased the car, slamming against the sides, clawing at the windows, leaving long, deep scratches in the glass. The fog started to thin, and for a moment, I thought we might actually escape. But then the car screeched to a halt, throwing us forward in our seats. My dad yelled, "What the hell?" And we all looked ahead. The road was gone. We were back at the barn. It was as if we'd never left, the twisted, looming structure waiting for us like an open grave. The shadows surrounded the car, closing in, and for the first time, Albert stepped forward, leaving the barn entirely. He didn't walk. He glided, his movements unnaturally smooth, his grin returning as he raised a hand and pointed directly at Emily. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice echoing inside my head. I reached for Emily, pulling her close, but Albert only laughed. The shadows began to seep into the car, curling around our legs like smoke, and no matter how much we screamed or struggled, we couldn't stop it. My dad tried to drive again, but the car wouldn't move. The shadows were pulling us back, dragging us toward the barn. The car felt like it was sinking, dragged into the earth itself by the shadows. The air grew colder, and the fog outside seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows as if it were alive. Emily was screaming, thrashing in the back seat, but the shadows were relentless, curling around her ankles and pulling her toward the door. My dad slammed his fists on the steering wheel, yelling, "Not my family! You're not taking them!" He turned to us, his eyes wide with fear, but also with determination. "Get out of the car! Now!" We hesitated, but the car began to groan and creak, the frame bending under the pressure of the shadows. My dad threw open his door and dragged my mom out, yelling at us to follow. I grabbed Emily, pulling her free from the smoky tendrils wrapping around her legs. The moment we were outside, the car began to collapse inward, as if it were being crushed by an invisible force. Albert was still standing in front of the barn, his grin wide and victorious, his eyes locked on Emily. "You can't run from me," he said, his voice echoing through the fog. The shadows swirled around us, cutting off every direction but one, the barn. My dad held my mom close, muttering under his breath, and I could see the panic in his eyes. He looked at Emily, who was shaking violently, and then at me. "We need to end this," he said. "If we don't, he'll never stop." I didn't know what he meant until he reached into his pocket and pulled out the torn paper Henry had given us, the one with the symbols. It was wrinkled and damp, but somehow it hadn't been destroyed in the chaos. My mom gasped, realizing what he was about to do. "No, it's too dangerous," she cried, grabbing his arm. But my dad shook his head. "It's the only way," he said firmly. "This started in the barn, and that's where it ends." Before we could stop him, he sprinted toward the barn, the shadows parting around him like they were afraid. Albert's grin faltered, and for the first time, I saw something like anger flicker across his face. "You'll regret this," Albert hissed, his voice low and venomous. The shadows surged forward, chasing after my dad as he disappeared into the barn. Emily screamed, running after him, but my mom held her back, her arms shaking. "We have to trust him," she whispered, though it sounded like she was trying to convince herself. The seconds felt like hours as my dad vanished into the barn. The air around us grew impossibly cold, and the fog seemed to close in tighter, suffocating us. Emily was sobbing, clawing at my mom's arms to break free, but she wouldn't let go. I couldn't see anything inside the barn except the faint flicker of the lanterns, casting long, distorted shadows. Then came the sound, a guttural roar so loud and unnatural it made my ears ring. It wasn't just Albert. It was something deeper, darker, like the barn itself was screaming in anger. The shadows outside surged violently, writhing and twisting as if they were in pain. For a moment, I thought it was over, that my dad had somehow won. But then the barn began to shake. The walls groaned and splintered, and the roof seemed to sag even further. A blinding light burst from the doorway, and I had to shield my eyes. Emily screamed, "Dad," and broke free from my mom's grip, running toward the barn. I chased after her, yelling for her to stop, but she didn't listen. We reached the threshold of the barn just as the shaking stopped. The light was gone, and the oppressive darkness returned. Inside, it was quiet, too quiet. The lanterns flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space. My dad was standing in the center of the barn, his back to us, holding the piece of paper. The shadows were gone, completely vanished, and for a brief moment, relief washed over me. "Dad," I called out, my voice trembling. He turned slowly, and that's when I saw his face. He was smiling, but it wasn't his smile. It was Albert's. That same twisted, cruel grin stretched across his face, and his eyes were dark, empty voids. Emily froze, her body trembling violently. No, it's not him," she whispered, taking a step back. My dad, or whatever he'd become, looked at us and spoke in a voice that wasn't his own. "He's gone, but I'm still here." My mom let out a choked sob, collapsing to her knees, while Emily grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the door. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the barn floor as I stared at my dad, or what used to be my dad. That grin, those hollow, lifeless eyes, it was Albert, no doubt about it. Emily was tugging at my arm, begging me to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. "You can't leave now," he said, his voice a twisted echo of my dad's, layered with something darker, something inhuman. He took a step toward us, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was savoring the fear radiating off of us. "This is where you belong now. With me?" Emily screamed, yanking harder on my arm, and that broke me out of my trance. I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the barn doors. My mom was still on her knees, crying and whispering my dad's name, like she couldn't accept what was happening. "Mom, get up!" I yelled, but she didn't move. The thing that looked like my dad started laughing, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the barn. The laughter sent chills down my spine, and I knew we couldn't wait any longer. "Emily, help me!" I shouted, and together we dragged my mom to her feet and toward the door. The moment we stepped outside, the air changed. The oppressive cold lifted slightly, and the fog began to thin. But I knew better than to think we were safe. The barn behind us groaned and creaked, the structure shifting as if it were alive. I turned back, and my heart nearly stopped. The shadows were back, spilling out of the barn like a living tide, and at their center was Albert, fully formed now, no longer needing my dad's body. His pale face glowed in the moonlight, and his smirk was wider than ever. "You can't run from me," he said, his voice carrying over the distance like a whisper directly in my ear. We bolted, half dragging my mom as we stumbled toward the car. The fog was almost gone now, revealing the empty stretch of road ahead. We threw open the doors, piling in as fast as we could. My dad's keys were still in the ignition, and the engine roared to life on the first turn. For a brief, desperate moment, I thought we might actually escape. But as we sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him. Albert, standing in the middle of the road, his figure shrinking in the distance, but his presence still palpable. His grin hadn't faltered, and I knew deep down that this wasn't over. The drive home was silent, except for Emily's muffled sobs and the occasional sniffle from my mom. No one spoke. I think we all knew there was nothing left to say. My dad was gone, and Albert had won. Even as the fog disappeared, and the night sky stretched out above us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. Every shadow on the side of the road looked like him. Every noise from the tires against the asphalt sounded like his voice whispering in the distance. When we finally reached my aunt's house, the three of us stumbled inside like we'd escaped a nightmare. My mom collapsed onto the couch, her hands still clutching the rosary, and Emily curled up next to her, trembling. I locked every door and window, even though I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever Albert was, he didn't need doors or windows to get in. We didn't sleep that night, and by morning, the sunlight felt more like an illusion of safety than anything real. Days turned into weeks, and we tried to go back to normal, but normal didn't exist anymore. My mom stopped going to work, Emily barely spoke, and when she did, it was always about Dad. She kept saying she could still feel him, still hear his voice. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. I felt it too. Little things started happening. Lights flickering, cold spots in the house, doors creaking open on their own. At first, I thought we were imagining it, that it was just our grief playing tricks on us. But then Emily showed me the picture. It was tucked under her pillow, and when she pulled it out, I froze. It was the same photo from the festival, but it had changed again. My dad was in it now, standing in the same spot Albert had been in before. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he wore that same twisted grin. "He's still with us," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "He'll never leave." I wanted to burn it, to destroy it, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Albert wasn't just in the photo anymore. He was part of us now, and there was no escaping him. I know this might sound strange, maybe even absurd, but something happened to Pooh. Something I still can't explain, even after all these years. I haven't been back to the 100-acre woods since it all happened, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever want to. Back then, we were all so close. Pooh, Piglet, Tigger, Yor, all of us. Those summers were magical, simple, filled with the kind of warmth you think can never fade. But one summer, it all changed. It started the day Pooh found that damn pot of honey. He said he discovered it in a clearing on the far side of the woods, a part none of us really ventured into. Pooh always loved honey, but this pot, it was different, bigger than any I'd seen. Its surface was a dull, tarnished gold with strange symbols carved into it. Symbols that didn't look like anything I'd seen in any of my books. Pooh was so excited when he brought it back. He kept saying the honey inside smelled incredible, better than anything he'd ever tasted. But when he pried the lid open, I swear the air around us shifted. The smell was sweet, yes, but there was something else, something bitter and sharp like metal or decay. It made my stomach twist. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Pooh did what he always did. He grabbed a spoon and dug right in. He ate and ate, humming to himself like he always did. But the next day, things were off. Pooh wasn't at his usual spot by the tree where he liked to nap. Piglet found him wandering near the edge of the forest, mumbling to himself. He said Pooh didn't recognize him at first, even though they'd been friends for years. When I found him later, he looked tired, like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes seemed darker somehow, sunken and distant, but he smiled and said he was fine. I wanted to believe him, but something felt wrong. I just couldn't figure out what. Over the next few days, things got worse. Pooh started acting strangely, even for him. He'd always been a little forgetful, but now it was like he didn't even know where he was half the time. He kept wandering off on his own, muttering about, finding more. Well, what? I didn't know. When we asked him, he'd laugh it off and change the subject, but there was this edge to his voice that wasn't like him. Even Tigger noticed, and he usually ignored anything that wasn't fun. He told me, "Something ain't right with OL, Pooh Bear." That was the first time I felt real fear about what was happening. The others tried to help. Piglet, bless him, was the first to reach out. He went to Pooh's house with some fresh flowers, hoping to cheer him up. But when Piglet came back, he looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. He wouldn't tell us what happened, just kept shaking his head and whispering, "He's not Pooh anymore. I want to check on him myself the next day." Pooh wasn't in his usual chair or by the fireplace. I found him in the back, sitting cross-legged on the floor with that pot of honey. He didn't look up when I came in. His paw was sticky, trembling as he scooped out another bite. And his eyes, those bright, friendly eyes, were blank, almost hollow. I asked him if he was okay, but he didn't answer at first. When he finally did, his voice sounded distant, like he was talking to someone far away. "It's not enough," he said. "I need more." I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent chills through me. The pot of honey, it should have been empty by then, but somehow it wasn't. It looked just as full as when he'd found it. That's when I noticed the symbols on the pot weren't the same as before. They'd changed, grown more elaborate, like they were spreading. I tried to take the pot away, but Pooh grabbed my wrist harder than I thought he could. "Don't," he said, his voice low and cold. "You wouldn't understand." After that, none of us could ignore it anymore. Even Eeyore, who rarely got involved, said he felt something was wrong in the woods. The air felt heavier, and the trees seemed taller, darker. It was subtle at first, but soon we all started hearing things. Whispers carried on the wind, too faint to make out but impossible to ignore. Tigger stopped bouncing as much, saying he felt like something was watching him. Rabbit claimed his garden wasn't growing right, even though it had always thrived. It was as if the 100-acre wood itself was changing, twisting into something we didn't recognize. And at the center of it all was Pooh and that cursed pot of honey. One evening, Piglet came running to me, his little legs trembling so much he could barely stand. He was crying, saying he heard Pooh talking to someone in the woods. Not another animal. There was no one else around, but someone. I tried to calm him down, but deep down, I felt the same unease he did. So, I decided to go see for myself. I grabbed the lantern and headed toward Pooh's house. The path there felt longer than usual, the trees closing in on me like a tunnel. By the time I reached his door, the sun was gone, and the woods were eerily silent. No crickets, no breeze, just the sound of my footsteps and my breathing. Pooh wasn't inside. The pot of honey was gone too, and the air smelled thick, like that strange metallic sweetness I'd noticed before. I called out for him, but no one answered. That's when I saw the footprints leading into the forest, deeper into the part we'd always avoided. They were sticky, leaving dark marks on the ground, almost like tar. Against my better judgment, I followed them. With each step, the forest seemed darker, the trees more twisted. The lantern's light barely reached beyond a few feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, Pooh's voice, but it didn't sound like him. It was deeper, almost guttural, and he was laughing. Not his usual soft chuckle, but something cold and sharp, like broken glass. I finally saw him in a clearing, sitting cross-legged with a pot of honey in front of him. The symbols on it were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Pooh's fur looked matted and darker than usual, as if it had been stained. He didn't look up when I approached. Instead, he dipped his paw into the pot and raised it to his mouth, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was in a trance. "Pooh," I said, my voice shaking. He stopped mid-motion, his paw hovering near his face. Then he turned to look at me, and I'll never forget his eyes. They weren't Pooh's eyes anymore. They were black, glossy, and empty, like looking into a void. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice echoing in a way that didn't make sense. Before I could respond, the wind picked up, swirling around the clearing. The trees seemed to groan, their branches reaching down like claws. The whispers I'd been hearing grew louder, almost deafening, but I still couldn't understand them. Pooh stood up, clutching the pot to his chest. "It's too late now," he said almost sadly. "I can't stop it." Then he turned and walked deeper into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I wanted to follow him, but something held me back, an overwhelming sense of dread, like if I took one more step, I'd never find my way out. So I ran. I don't even remember how I made it back to the others, but when I did, I couldn't stop shaking. When I got back to the others, I could barely get the words out. Piglet was already trembling, his tiny hands clutching his ears like he was trying to block out the whispers we all seemed to hear now. Tigger, usually so full of energy, just sat there staring at the ground. "What did you see?" Rabbit asked, his voice sharp but laced with fear. I tried to explain. The pot, the symbols, the way Pooh's eyes had looked, but the words felt hollow, like they couldn't capture the wrongness of it all. None of us could sleep that night. The forest didn't feel like home anymore. The wind seemed to carry voices, and the shadows stretched too far, like they were alive. The next morning, Christopher Robin showed up. He hadn't been around much that summer, and I could see the worry on his face the moment he arrived. "What's going on?" he asked, looking at all of us huddled together like frightened children. I told him everything, trying to keep my voice steady, but when I got to the part about Pooh, Christopher's face changed. He didn't look surprised. He looked scared. "I need to see him," he said, grabbing his bag and heading toward the woods before we could stop him. None of us wanted to go back there, but we couldn't let him go alone. So we followed, even though every instinct screamed at us to turn back. We found Pooh near the same clearing I'd seen him in the night before. But now the place looked wrong. The trees surrounding it were dead, their bark blackened and twisted. The ground was soft and wet, like it had been soaked in something thick and sticky. And there was Pooh, sitting in the center with a pot of honey, his back to us. Christopher called out to him, but Pooh didn't move. When we got closer, the smell hit us, sweet and rotten, like fruit left to decay in the sun. Christopher stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Pooh, it's me, Christopher Robin. What's going on?" Pooh turned slowly, and for a moment, I thought he recognized him. But then he smiled, and it wasn't the warm, friendly smile we all knew. It was stretched too wide, his teeth bared in a way that made my stomach churn. "Christopher," he said, his voice low and mocking. "You came back." His paw dipped into the honey, and as he lifted it, I saw something moving in it, tiny black shapes writhing like insects. He licked it clean, his eyes never leaving Christopher. "You should try some," he said, holding the pot out. "It's divine." Christopher froze, staring at Pooh as if he were seeing a stranger. None of us moved. The pot of honey glistened in the dim light, and I swear the symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift, crawling like living things. Pooh held it out farther, his paw trembling slightly. "Don't be rude, Christopher," he said, his voice lilting unnaturally, like he was mocking the way he used to sound. "It's what you always wanted, isn't it? To see what's out there beyond the trees. To taste something more." His eyes, black and endless, locked onto Christopher's, and for a moment, I thought Christopher might take it. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out, but then he stopped, shaking his head. "No," Christopher said firmly, his voice breaking the eerie silence. "This isn't you, Pooh. Whatever that is, it's not for us." Pooh's smile faltered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Pain, maybe a regret. But then his face hardened, and he pulled the pot back to his chest, clutching it like a lifeline. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have to. It's too late." He turned away from us, his shoulders slumping. "You should leave. All of you." But we didn't. We couldn't. Christopher stepped closer, reaching out a hand. "We're not leaving you, Pooh," he said softly. "We can fix this. We just need to get rid of." Before he could finish, Pooh spun around with a speed that made my heart stop. His paw lashed out, knocking Christopher back into the dirt. "No!" Pooh roared, his voice echoing unnaturally, like it came from the woods themselves. The ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and the whispers we'd been hearing grew louder, more insistent. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting toward us like skeletal fingers. Tigger grabbed my arm. "We gotta go," he said, his voice trembling, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. But Christopher wouldn't move. He stood up, brushing the dirt off his knees, and looked at Pooh with a mix of sadness and determination. "We're not leaving," he said again, his voice steady. "We're your friends, Pooh. We'll fight this together." Pooh's body shook, his fur bristling, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out again. But then he let out a low, broken laugh. "You can't fight it," he said, turning his gaze back to the pot. "It's already here." Pooh's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "It's already here." The forest seemed to react, the ground beneath us feeling softer, almost like it was alive. Christopher didn't back down. "Then we'll stop it," he said, his voice firm, though I could hear the tremor in it. Pooh looked at him, and for the briefest moment, his expression softened. But then his eyes darkened again, and he clutched the pot tighter, as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "It's not just the honey. It's everything. The woods they've always been watching." Those words sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around at the trees towering over us, their branches swaying even though there was no wind. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, moving independently of the light. "Pooh," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What did you bring here?" He didn't answer, but the way he glanced at the pot told me everything. Whatever that honey was, it wasn't just food, it was something ancient, something that had been waiting to be found. And Pooh had been the one to open the door. Tigger tugged on Christopher's sleeve. "We need to go, buddy," he said, his usual bounds completely gone. "This place ain't safe anymore." Christopher hesitated, torn between leaving and trying to help Pooh. But before he could make a decision, the clearing changed. The ground beneath us cracked, and a deep, low sound filled the air, like a groan from something massive and alive. The pot in Pooh's hands began to glow, the symbols pulsing faster and faster. Pooh staggered, dropping to his knees, and for the first time, he looked scared. "I told you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's too late." The whispers that had haunted us for days grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. I couldn't understand the words, but they were filled with malice, crawling into my ears and burrowing into my mind. Piglet screamed, clutching his head, and even Tigger dropped to the ground, covering his ears. Christopher, however, stood his ground. "Pooh," he shouted over the noise. "You have to let it go. Destroy the pot." Pooh looked at him, his paws shaking, and for a moment I thought he might do it. But then he shook his head. "I can't," he said, tears streaming down his face. "It's not mine to destroy." The ground beneath us began to shift, rising and falling in waves like it was breathing. The clearing felt alive, a pulsing, writhing thing that seemed to react to every movement we made. The glow from the pot intensified, and the symbols carved into its surface now radiated with a sickly, golden light that painted everything around us in an unnatural hue. Pooh, still clutching the pot, looked more fragile than ever, his fur damp with sweat, his body trembling like a puppet on fraying strings. "It's not just the honey," he muttered, almost to himself. "It's the forest. It always was." Christopher stepped forward again, ignoring the trembling earth and the deafening whispers around us. "Then we'll destroy the forest if we have to," he said, his voice filled with a desperation I'd never heard before. Pooh let out a bitter laugh, one that sounded wrong coming from him. "You can't destroy it," he said. "It's part of us now. Part of me?" His voice cracked on that last word, and for a moment, I saw the old Pooh, the friend we all loved, flicker across his face. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by something darker, something I didn't recognize. The clearing began to close in on us. The trees bent inward, their branches curling like claws. Shadows stretched toward us, moving faster now, like they had a purpose. Piglet whimpered, clinging to Tigger, who for once had no jokes to offer. Rabbit was frozen in place, his wide eyes darting between the pot and the encroaching darkness. "We have to do something," I shouted, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the cacophony around us. Christopher's gaze locked onto the pot. "That's it," he said, his voice low but steady. "The pot is the key. If we destroy it, maybe this will stop." But Pooh heard him. His head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "No," he roared, clutching the pot tighter. "You don't understand. Without it, I'm nothing." He staggered to his feet, swaying like he was fighting something inside himself. The ground buckled, and we all stumbled, struggling to stay upright. "Pooh, please," Christopher pleaded. "This isn't you. You're more than this. You're our friend." For a moment, I thought Christopher's words might reach him. Pooh's grip on the pot loosened, and his shoulders slumped. But then the glow from the symbols flared, brighter than ever, and his face twisted in pain. "I can't stop it," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's too strong." The ground cracked open beneath us, splitting into jagged crevices that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. From the depths came a sound, a deep, resonating hum, like the growl of something ancient and angry. Christopher didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing for the pot. Pooh tried to pull back, his paws gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white, but Christopher wasn't letting go. "Let it go, Pooh," he shouted, his voice filled with raw emotion. "This isn't you. It's never been you." Pooh growled, a low, guttural sound I didn't think he was capable of, and for a moment, it looked like he might strike Christopher. But instead, his legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees. "I don't want to lose myself," Pooh whispered, his voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the chaos around us. His eyes, now flickering between black voids and the warm, familiar brown we knew, met Christopher's. "But I can't stop it." "You have to," he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the pot. The glow was blinding now, the symbols writhing like living things. Christopher gritted his teeth and pulled with all his strength, tearing the pot from Pooh's grasp. The moment it left his paws, the entire forest screamed, or at least it felt like it did. The sound wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head, vibrating through my bones. Christopher didn't waste a second. He hurled the pot to the ground with all his might, and it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The glow vanished instantly, plunging the clearing into near-total darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. For a moment, none of us moved. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the ground began to stabilize, the cracks sealing themselves as if they'd never been there. The trees straightened, their branches no longer reaching for us. But Pooh collapsed. We rushed to him, but he looked so small, so fragile. His fur was dull, his eyes half closed. "Is it over?" Piglet asked, his voice trembling. Christopher knelt beside Pooh, cradling him like a child. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy with grief. Pooh blinked slowly, looking up at Christopher. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then his eyes closed, and for a moment, I thought he was gone. But his chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. Whatever had taken hold of him seemed to be gone, but so was a part of him, something we'd never get back. We stayed there in the clearing for what felt like hours, none of us knowing what to do next. Pooh's breathing was faint but steady, and Christopher wouldn't let go of him. The forest around us seemed still, almost eerily so, as if it were holding back its true nature. None of us spoke, afraid that even a whisper might stir something back to life. Finally, Christopher broke the silence. "We need to get him home," he said, his voice firm but strained. Tigger nodded and helped Christopher lift Pooh. He was surprisingly light, like all the strength had been drained from his body. The walk back to Pooh's house was agonizing. Every step felt like it took hours, the forest still heavy with that strange energy. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting them to move again, but they stood still, their branches lifeless. When we reached Pooh's house, Christopher laid him gently on his bed. Piglet brought a blanket and tucked it around him, his tiny hands shaking the whole time. "Is he going to be okay?" Piglet asked, his voice breaking. Christopher didn't answer right away. He just sat by the bed, staring at Pooh's motionless form. "I think he will," he finally said, though he didn't sound convinced. Over the next few days, things in the 100-acre would seem to return to normal, at least on the surface. The forest was quiet again, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. But none of us could shake the feeling that something had changed. Pooh stayed in his house, too weak to leave his bed. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was in a soft, distant voice, like he was speaking from a dream. The honey pot was gone, but its memory lingered. Every time I passed that part of the forest, I felt a chill, like something was still watching. Christopher visited Pooh every day, sitting by his side and talking to him, even if Pooh didn't respond. One afternoon, as I stood outside the house, I heard Christopher ask, "Do you remember what it felt like?" There was a long pause, and then Pooh whispered, "It felt like hunger." But not mine. That was the last time Pooh spoke about the pot or what happened in the clearing. Slowly, he began to recover, but he was never the same. His laugh didn't have the same warmth, and his eyes carried a weight I couldn't understand. I've always been a skeptic. Curses, ghosts, ancient forces. They were just stories people told themselves to make sense of the unknown. My world was built on words, symbols, and meanings, solid, logical things. But after what happened in March of 2024, here in Ashcroft, Massachusetts, I'm not sure I even believe in reality anymore. It started with a package that arrived out of the blue, addressed to me, Arthur Linford. The envelope was brittle, yellowed with age, and the ink on it was almost illegible. There was no return address, just a name, Dr. Enoch Wiles. Inside was a manuscript, older than anything I'd ever handled. I've spent my life as a linguist, but this script was unlike anything I'd seen before. The language didn't fit into any known system. For me, it was the kind of puzzle you couldn't resist. At first, it was just academic curiosity. I spent hours locked in my office, surrounded by dictionaries, reference books, and my laptop, trying to decipher the bizarre symbols. Piece by piece, I began to tease out meanings, but something about the process felt wrong. Every word I translated felt like it echoed, not in the room, but in my head. The air grew thick and heavy in the office, and on more than one occasion, I thought I heard faint whispers, not from outside, but from within the walls. By the third night, the dreams began. Not ordinary dreams, but vivid nightmares. I saw something, a figure cloaked in shadows and impossible geometry. Its name came to me unbidden, Zagrathel. And the worst part? I knew it was aware of me, watching me as I watched it. The nightmares became relentless. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those swirling, impossible shapes and hear that name, Zagrathel, echoing in a voice that wasn't mine but seemed to come from inside me. By the fifth day, I'd made significant progress on the manuscript, but something strange started happening. My apartment felt off. It was subtle at first, shadows that seemed a little too long, objects not quite where I'd left them. Then it became more noticeable. The air seemed charged, like before a lightning storm, and the silence wasn't really silent anymore. There was always this faint hum, like the sound of distant machinery, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. One night, while translating a particularly complex section, the lights in my office flickered and then went out completely. I sat there, frozen, with only the dim glow of my desk lamp powered by backup batteries. That's when I heard it, clearer than before. A voice. It wasn't speaking any language I knew, but the tone was unmistakable. It was speaking to me. My chest tightened, and I felt paralyzed, unable to turn around. Then I noticed something that sent chills through me. The shadows on the wall were moving, shifting in ways that didn't match the light from the lamp. They formed shapes, letters almost, but not from any alphabet I recognized. My hands trembled as I wrote them down, as if compelled. It wasn't until later that I realized they matched some of the symbols from the manuscript. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The symbols I'd scribbled down pulsed in my mind, as if they carried some hidden weight. I kept staring at them, trying to make sense of their meaning, but the more I focused, the more my vision blurred, and I started to hear that hum again. Except this time, it wasn't distant. It was inside my head, growing louder and louder until I thought my skull would crack. I shoved the papers into a drawer and slammed it shut, desperate to block out whatever I'd let into my mind. But it was too late. The damage was done. The next morning, I stepped outside, hoping some fresh air might clear my head. That's when I realized something was wrong with the city itself. Ashcroft has always been quiet, a place where people keep to themselves, but now it felt empty. The streets were quiet, eerily so. No dogs barking, no kids playing, not even the usual hum of traffic. It was like the whole town was holding its breath. The few people I saw looked off. Their movements were slow and uncoordinated, and their faces were blank, like they weren't really seeing the world around them. I caught my reflection in a shop window, and for a second, I didn't recognize myself. My eyes looked sunken, and there was something unfamiliar in them, like I was seeing someone else staring back at me. By the time I made it back to my apartment, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my head pounded with that same low hum. But what really scared me was the sensation of being watched. It was constant now, like there were eyes on me from every corner of the room. I locked the door, closed the curtains, and sat down at my desk. I thought maybe if I could finish translating the manuscript, I could find an answer, something that would explain what was happening. That was when I noticed the drawer where I had stuffed the symbols. It was open. The papers I had written on were scattered across the floor, but they weren't blank anymore. Lines and shapes had been added to them, symbols I hadn't written. I swear to you, I never touched them. My chest tightened as I picked one up. The lines connected into something that looked like an eye, and in that moment, I felt a presence in the room. It wasn't visible, but I could feel it, cold and heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The whispers started again, louder this time, and I could make out fragments of words. Open, gateway, release. I slammed the papers back into the drawer, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, like the walls themselves were speaking. I don't remember how long I sat there, frozen in fear. The whispers ebbed and flowed like waves, sometimes fading into unintelligible murmurs, and other times surging into a cacophony that made my ears ring. I tried to drown it out, cover my ears, turn on music, anything, but it didn't help. It wasn't just sound. It was in my head, a pressure building behind my eyes. At some point, I must have passed out because when I woke up, it was dark outside and my office looked wrong. The furniture was where I'd left it, but the walls seemed closer, the angle sharper, like the room itself had shifted while I was unconscious. That's when I noticed the manuscript. It was open on my desk, though I'd locked it away before collapsing. The pages I hadn't translated were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Against my better judgment, I approached it. The glow intensified, and I could feel the heat radiating from the pages. My hands moved on their own, flipping through until I reached a page filled with symbols I hadn't even seen before. And then it happened, a rush of images flooded my mind. Not dreams or visions, but memories. Except they weren't mine. I saw a barren, desolate world under a sky of swirling black clouds. Cities crumbled into dust, and a towering figure loomed over it all, its form too massive, too alien to comprehend. Zagrafel. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. The vision was so vivid, so real, that I could still feel the heat of that dying world and smell the acrid smoke from its ruins. My head was spinning, and my body felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. It wasn't just a memory. It was like I had been there. I glanced at the manuscript, now lying on the floor, its pages still glowing faintly. For a brief moment, I considered burning it, destroying it completely. But a part of me hesitated. It felt like the manuscript wanted me to finish, like it had a will of its own, urging me to keep translating, as if the answers were just out of reach. That's when I heard the sound from outside. It wasn't the hum this time. It was something else, something worse. It was a deep, guttural groaning, like the earth itself was in pain. I looked out the window, and my blood ran cold. The sky over Ashcroft had changed. The stars weren't where they should be, and the moon had a strange reddish hue, almost like it was bleeding. But what terrified me most were the people. They were standing in the streets, motionless, their heads tilted back as if staring at something I couldn't see. Their mouths moved silently, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then all at once they turned to face my building, every single one of them, and even from this distance, I could see their eyes. They weren't human anymore. I froze, unable to look away from the window. Their eyes, black, glossy, and too large for their faces, seemed to pierce through the glass, through me. It felt like they could see straight into my mind, like they knew exactly what I had done. My breath caught in my throat as one of them, a woman with matted hair and a twisted neck, raised her arm and pointed directly at my apartment. The others followed, one by one, their movements slow and unnatural, as if they were being controlled by invisible strings. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. I yanked the curtains shut and backed away, but I could still feel their gaze. The groaning sound grew louder, vibrating through the walls. The apartment seemed to be alive now, shifting and creaking as if it were breathing. My phone buzzed on the desk, startling me. For a moment, I hesitated to answer, but the thought of hearing another human voice, any voice, overpowered my fear. I picked it up and saw a single text from an unknown number. "You can't stop it. Finish the translation." My hands were trembling so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. How did they know? Who was this? Before I could respond, the power went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. The only light was the faint glow of the manuscript on the floor, pulsing like it was alive. I stood there in the dark, clutching the phone like it was some kind of lifeline, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The manuscript's glow cast faint, flickering shadows across the room, and those shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense. They twisted and writhed, forming shapes that made my stomach churn just to look at them. I wanted to run, to get as far away from Ashcroft, from my apartment, from that cursed manuscript as possible. But I couldn't. My legs refused to move, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this was, it wasn't confined to my apartment or even this town. It was bigger than that. It was everywhere now. I finally forced myself to pick up the manuscript again. My hands shook as I flipped through the glowing pages, and I realized I had translated most of it already. Only a few passages remained, but something inside me screamed not to finish. The whispers returned, louder than ever, like dozens of voices overlapping, urging me on. "Finish it," they chanted, their words a relentless chorus. My eyes scanned the symbols, and before I knew what I was doing, I began to translate. The words flowed effortlessly, almost as if I wasn't the one writing them. My pen moved faster and faster until the final sentence was complete. The moment the last word hit the page, everything stopped. The whispers, the groaning, even the unnatural hum in my head. For a moment, there was silence. The silence was worse than the noise. It was oppressive, like the world itself had paused, holding its breath. I stared at the manuscript, the final words still fresh on the page, written in ink that seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the faint light. The glowing stopped, and the manuscript looked just like any old document again. I dared to hope that it was over, that whatever I'd unleashed had been stopped. But then I felt it, something shifting in the room. The air grew impossibly cold, and a deep vibration ran through the floor, rattling the furniture. I turned toward the window, drawn by a presence I couldn't ignore. Pulling the curtains back, I saw the town of Ashcroft transformed. The sky was no longer dark, but instead a swirling vortex of unnatural colors. Reds, purples, and blacks that bled into each other like ink and water. The people were gone, replaced by towering figures that seemed to rise out of the ground itself, their bodies twisted and contorted beyond recognition. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. My chest tightened as I realized they were looking at me, their eyeless faces locked onto my window. And then, in the center of it all, I saw it. Zagrathal. Its form defied logic, its sheer size blotting out the sky, its movements impossibly fluid. It wasn't walking, it was unfolding like a shadow spilling across dimensions. My body locked up as I stared at Zagrathal. Its form was indescribable, not because it lacked definition, but because every time I tried to focus on a detail, it shifted like it was rejecting my perception of it. Limbs extended and retracted, faces appeared and dissolved, and its presence was like staring into infinity. My mind screamed for me to look away, but I couldn't. The vortex in the sky seemed to pulse in rhythm with the entity, and I realized it wasn't just standing there. It was watching me, waiting for something. Then, as if answering a silent command, the manuscript on my desk burst into flames. The fire didn't consume the paper in a normal way. It was black, smokeless, and cold, yet the pages disintegrated into nothing within seconds. I stumbled back, panicked, but it didn't stop there. The walls of my apartment began to warp and buckle, the ceiling stretching upward into an impossibly tall void. The room was no longer a room. It was a space between spaces, an endless expanse filled with faint whispers and distant screams. Zagrathal's voice cut through it all, deep and resonant, vibrating in my bones. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. The portal wasn't just open, it was inside me. I fell to my knees as the realization hit me. The portal wasn't some physical doorway buried in the earth. It was in my mind, carved into my consciousness by the words I had translated. Zagrathal had been waiting, using me as the key to bridge whatever unfathomable dimension it came from. I clutched my head, trying to block out its voice, but it was everywhere, inside me, outside me, in the very air I breathed. I could feel it probing my thoughts, unraveling my memories, sifting through everything that made me who I was. My identity, my sense of self, was slipping away, piece by piece. The room, or whatever it had become, was disintegrating around me. The walls were dissolving into an endless black void, and I could see shapes moving within it. They were like shadows, but alive, writhing and stretching as if struggling to break through. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out. I couldn't fight it anymore. My body was numb. My mind a fractured mess of fear and incomprehensible images. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. I thought this was the end, that I would be consumed completely. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Everything stopped. I blinked, and the silence felt like it would crush me. My apartment was back. Or at least it looked like it was. The walls, the furniture, even the faint smell of burnt coffee from the morning before. It was all exactly as it had been. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't see. I stumbled to the window, half expecting to see the vortex still swirling in the sky, but Ashcroft had returned to its usual quiet. The streets were empty, but now it felt like normal emptiness, not the oppressive, unnatural void it had been before. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over, that whatever had happened had passed. But then I caught my reflection in the glass. My heart stopped. The face staring back at me was mine, but it wasn't me. My eyes were wrong, darker, sunken, and there was something in them, something watching. I staggered back, and the hum returned, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from outside or the walls. It was coming from me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The portal hadn't closed. It had merged with me. I wasn't just the one who opened it. I was the doorway now. And whatever I'd let through wasn't gone. It was still here, waiting, growing stronger. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at my reflection, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But the hum wouldn't stop, and every second, I felt less and less like myself. My thoughts weren't just my own anymore. There were others, whispers beneath my consciousness, weaving foreign ideas into my mind. I could feel Zugrathel, not as a presence outside of me, but as something coiled deep within, waiting. I clutched the edges of the desk to steady myself, but even the solid wood felt unfamiliar, like I was touching it through someone else's hands. I tried to think of what to do, how to stop this, but I knew there was no going back. The manuscript was gone, reduced to ash, and yet the knowledge it contained was now a part of me. Every symbol, every phrase I had translated was etched into my mind like scars. Then came the final blow. The whispers turned into a single voice, Zagrathel's voice, deep and resonant, speaking directly into my thoughts. "You are the gate," it said, and in that moment, I understood. The portal wasn't a doorway to be opened or closed. It was a transformation, and I was its vessel. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sensation of the ground beneath me dissolving. Not physically, but mentally, as if reality itself was unraveling. I woke up hours later, maybe even days, I can't be sure. The apartment was empty, stripped of everything except me. The hum was gone, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was waiting. I left Ashcroft that day, but no matter where I go, I can feel it. Something is following me. Something is watching, not just through me, but through anyone I come near. I've tried to warn people, but they look at me like I'm insane. Maybe I am, but I know one thing for sure. The portal isn't closed. It's spreading, and one day, when it's ready, it will open completely. When that happens, I don't think anyone will be able to stop it. When I boarded the Noctis train, I felt a mix of relief and anticipation, as if I was leaving behind a life that had never truly worked out. The night was thick with fog, the kind that seems to swallow everything around it, but the locomotive gleamed like a beacon. It was luxurious, almost oppressively perfect, with polished metal carriages and golden light spilling out of the windows. I remember thinking it felt like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Everyone at the small station was eerily quiet, exchanging hesitant glances, as if none of us really knew what to expect. I don't even fully remember how I got there. The information about Eternia was vague, but something about the name was irresistible, like I'd heard it before, though I couldn't say where. Inside the train, the atmosphere was even more surreal. Immaculate leather seats, a dining car with crystal chandeliers, and a bar that looked like it belonged in an old movie. But what really stood out to me were the other passengers. Each of them seemed weighed down by some unspoken burden, as if everyone there was running from something. There was a woman in a black dress flipping through a photo album, but she never turned the pages. A man in a worn-out suit clutched his suitcase so tightly that his knuckles were white. Even without speaking much, the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. When the train finally started moving, something strange happened. There was no lurch, no familiar jolt. It felt like we were floating, gliding in perfect silence along the tracks. That's when I realized this journey would be unlike anything I'd ever experienced. As the train picked up speed, the windows revealed landscapes that didn't make any sense. At first, it was just endless fog, thick and impenetrable, but soon, strange shapes began to emerge. Bare trees lined the tracks, their branches twisted like grasping hands. They almost seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the distance, mountains shifted unnaturally, like they were breathing. I remember staring out the window, my chest tightening, as I realized the stars in the sky were wrong. They flickered too brightly, forming constellations I'd never seen before. A woman sitting across from me whispered to herself, clutching a locket. I caught the words, "I'll see them soon," but I didn't dare ask what she meant. The real unease set in when I checked my watch. The trip was supposed to last one night, and yet my watch seemed broken. The second hand ticked forward, then backward, then froze completely. I asked the man with the suitcase if he had the time, but he only shook his head without meeting my eyes. That's when the steward appeared, a tall, gaunt man in an outdated uniform, his expression disturbingly neutral. He moved down the aisle, handing out what looked like maps. When he reached me, I hesitated before taking one. It was blank, just a piece of heavy parchment with no markings, no destination. "This must be a mistake," I said, but the steward just smiled faintly and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. I folded the blank map and slipped it into my coat pocket, trying to shake off the growing unease. Around me, the other passengers were reacting strangely to their own maps. The woman with the locket stared at hers, murmuring something under her breath, her fingers tracing invisible lines across the paper. The man with the suitcase didn't even look at his. He just shoved it into his pocket like he already knew what it would show. It was the first time I realized how quiet the train was. Too quiet. No sound of wheels on tracks, no hum of machinery. Just the faint rustling of passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I decided to explore the train, hoping to distract myself or maybe find someone who could explain the strangeness of it all. The dining car was practically deserted except for a young couple seated at a corner table. They weren't eating or talking, just staring at each other like they were trying to remember something they'd forgotten. Beyond the dining car, I found a door leading to another section of the train. As I reached for the handle, a sudden jolt ran through the floor, like the train had hit something. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I looked around, but no one else seemed to react. In fact, the passengers looked more detached, their faces slack, as if the jolt had drained something from them. I pushed through the door into the next car, my heart pounding. This section was dimly lit, the air heavier somehow, with a faint metallic smell that reminded me of blood. The windows here were completely blacked out, reflecting only my own pale, anxious face. The seats were empty, but I felt like I was being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia, but every step I took made the sensation worse. As I moved further in, I noticed a strange humming sound, low and rhythmic, almost like breathing. It seemed to come from the walls, vibrating faintly under my fingertips when I touched them. At the far end of the car, there was another door, but this one was different, older, almost rusted, with a small round window in its center. I leaned in to peer through it, and instantly wished I hadn't. The scene on the other side wasn't another car. It was something vast and incomprehensible, a swirling void of shadows and stars, with shapes shifting in and out of focus. They were huge, but indistinct, like trying to make sense of a half-remembered dream. And then, just for a second, I thought I saw faces in the darkness. Not human faces, something else entirely, with eyes that burned like dying embers. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat, as a voice behind me whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I spun around so fast I nearly fell, but no one was there. The car was still empty, silent except for the faint hum coming from the walls. My heart raced as I scanned every corner, convinced I'd heard someone speak. The voice had been close, too close, like someone leaning in to whisper directly into my ear. I backed away from the rusted door, every instinct screaming at me to leave. As I turned to head back to the previous car, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: faint handprints on the windows. Dozens of them, pressed into the glass as if people had been desperately trying to claw their way out. When I returned to the main passenger car, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt colder, and the passengers seemed different. The woman with the locket was no longer murmuring to herself. She was staring blankly at the ceiling, her mouth slightly open, as if in a trance. The man with the suitcase had left his seat, but his case remained behind, sitting oddly in the middle of the aisle. And then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Their reflections in the windows didn't match their movements. The few who were still seated were unnaturally still, but in the glass, their reflections twitched and shifted, their heads turning toward me even though their bodies hadn't moved. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation, but deep down, I knew this wasn't something I could explain. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that the exhaustion and strangeness of the journey were playing tricks on my mind. But the longer I stood there, the more impossible it was to deny. The reflections weren't just moving, they were watching me. Their eyes, blank and too bright, tracked my every step as I backed away down the aisle. My legs felt heavy, like the air itself was pushing against me. I reached out instinctively to steady myself on one of the seats, but the moment my hand touched the leather, the woman with the locket jerked her head toward me. Her real body this time. Her neck moved too fast, too sharply, like a puppet on strings. "You shouldn't have looked," she whispered, her voice raspy and dry, as if it hadn't been used in years. I stumbled back, knocking over the suitcase in the aisle. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the train. She didn't move again, just stared, her unblinking eyes locked onto mine. The other passengers, or whatever they were, remained still, but their reflections continued to shift, some now standing in the glass while their bodies sat frozen. I turned and ran toward the back of the train, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Every step felt wrong, like the floor beneath me was alive, shifting subtly under my weight. I reached the end of the car, slamming into the door and fumbling with the handle. My fingers felt numb, trembling as I pushed it open and stumbled into the next section. This car was unlike the others. The lights flickered erratically, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The seats were overturned, some ripped apart, as if something had torn through them in a frenzy. A deep, guttural groan reverberated through the space, and I realized it wasn't coming from a person. It was coming from the train itself. The walls seemed to pulse, faint ripples spreading across the metal like the train was breathing. I forced myself to move forward, trying not to focus on the oppressive hum that grew louder with every step. My chest felt tight, and my breathing came in shallow gasps. I reached for the next door, but as I did, the lights went out completely. The darkness was suffocating, so absolute that I couldn't even see my own hand in front of me. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffle, followed by a dragging sound. It was faint at first, but it was getting closer. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Then, just as the sound was almost upon me, the lights flickered back on, and I saw it. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, standing at the far end of the car. Its head tilted unnaturally, its limbs too long and jointed in ways that made no sense. I froze, my body refusing to move as the shadow stood there, unnervingly still, yet radiating a presence that felt suffocating. Its head tilted again, a sharp, unnatural motion, as if it were studying me. Then it started to move. It didn't walk, it glided, its elongated limbs barely brushing the ground as it closed the distance between us. My chest felt like it was being crushed, my breath coming in shallow, panic bursts. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward, reaching blindly for the door handle behind me, but it wouldn't budge. The shadow stopped just a few feet away, looming over me. Its shape wasn't solid. Parts of it seemed to ripple and fade, like smoke struggling to hold form. And then I saw its eyes, two pinpricks of light, impossibly bright, boring into me. The hum that had been vibrating through the walls grew louder, deeper, resonating in my bones. The thing leaned closer, and I felt an overwhelming wave of nausea, like every part of me was being pulled in different directions. It didn't speak, but I swear I heard words in my mind, not in any language I knew, yet I understood them perfectly. "You are part of it now." The words echoed in my head, heavy and inescapable, like they were being etched into my very thoughts. I stumbled backward again, finally managing to wrench the door open behind me. I fell through into the next car, slamming the door shut and locking it, my hands shaking so violently I could barely work the latch. The shadow didn't follow, not immediately, but the humming persisted, vibrating through the door, through me, like a pulse that wouldn't let me forget it was still there. This car was worse than the last. The seats were gone entirely, leaving only a cavernous, empty space. The walls were lined with strange symbols, glowing faintly in a color I couldn't name, shifting and writhing like they were alive. At the center of the car was something that froze me in place. A massive, pulsating mass of flesh. Machinery? I couldn't tell. It was a grotesque amalgamation, wires and organic tendrils writhing together, feeding into the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The train wasn't just alive, it was growing, breathing, feeding. And I knew, deep in my gut, that it was feeding on us. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing at the center of the car. It pulsed rhythmically, in sync with the oppressive hum that filled the air. The tendrils slithered slowly, snaking along the walls and ceiling, dripping with some kind of viscous, black fluid. I didn't want to move closer, but something about it pulled at me, an invisible force tugging at my mind, compelling me to step forward. My legs moved on their own, one slow, trembling step at a time, until I was standing just feet away from it. The closer I got, the louder the hum became, drilling into my skull, making it harder to think. Then I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pushing against the surface of the mass. Some were contorted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Others were eerily calm, their eyes wide and blank, as if they'd accepted whatever fate had consumed them. One of the faces suddenly shifted, its eyes snapping open and locking onto me. It wasn't random. It knew I was there. The mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the words appeared in my mind, the same as before. You are part of it now. My vision blurred, my head spinning as the tendrils twitched, inching toward me like they were alive, like they were ready to pull me in. I stumbled backward, desperate to get away from the writhing mass and the faces that seemed to watch me no matter where I moved. The tendrils twitched, inching closer, dragging themselves across the floor with wet, slithering sounds. I forced myself to turn and run, ignoring the dizziness and the hum that now felt like it was vibrating through my skull. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I reached the far end of the car, slamming into another door. This one was different, covered in the same glowing symbols that lined the walls. The door didn't budge. I clawed at it, banging my fists, yelling for help, but the noise seemed to be swallowed by the hum. Behind me, the tendrils had started moving faster, their tips curling and reaching out like fingers. My heart was racing, my chest heaving, and for a moment, I felt completely trapped. Then, almost by instinct, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the blank map the steward had given me earlier. To my horror, it wasn't blank anymore. Lines and shapes had appeared, twisting and spiraling across the parchment. At the center was a single word, written in jagged, almost violent strokes, Eternia. The word Eternia seemed to pulse on the map, the ink almost glowing in the dim light. I had no idea what it meant or why it had appeared now, but holding it made the hum in my head momentarily recede. Clutching the map tightly, I turned back toward the pulsating mass, the tendrils now just feet away from me. It was as if the map gave me clarity, a moment to think, though my body screamed at me to flee. Somehow, I realized the map wasn't just showing me Eternia, it was showing me the way out. I focused on the twisting lines, tracing them with my eyes, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. The door behind me wasn't locked in the usual sense. It was bound by the same unnatural force that powered the train. The symbols on the door matched the spirals on the map, and without thinking, I pressed the map against it. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the train shuddered violently, and the glowing symbols began to burn brighter, almost blinding. The tendrils recoiled, retreating as if the light hurt them. The door creaked open, just enough for me to slip through, and I didn't hesitate. I bolted into the next car, slamming it shut behind me. The next car was a stark contrast to the horrors I'd just escaped. It was eerily pristine, almost sterile, with bright white walls and seats arranged in perfect symmetry. There were no passengers, no sound, not even the faint hum I'd grown used to. For a moment, I felt like I'd stepped out of the train entirely, into some blank void. My legs trembled as I walked further in, the map still clutched tightly in my hand. The lines on it had shifted again, rearranging themselves into a spiral that pointed to a single seat at the far end of the car. As I approached the seat, I noticed something lying on it, a small, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, the cover cracked and worn, with no title. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, but what made my stomach drop was that it wasn't random. It was my handwriting. Every word, every sentence was something I had thought or said in my life. Things I hadn't told anyone, things I'd buried deep. My hands shook as I flipped through, the words growing more recent until they described, in vivid detail, everything that had just happened on the train. I slammed the book shut, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't possible. None of this was. My mind raced, trying to piece together how my thoughts, my memories, could be written here before I'd even lived them. My instinct was to throw the book away, but something held me back. It felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it should have been, like it was anchoring me to something I couldn't understand. I forced myself to turn the pages again, and that's when I saw it. A section I hadn't reached yet. Words detailing events that hadn't happened yet. The writing described me standing in this car, holding the book just as I was now. But the next line made my blood run cold. And then he hears the footsteps. The second I read it, the sound began, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the car I had just fled. My chest tightened as I turned toward the door, the pristine silence of the car now broken by the rhythmic thud of someone or something approaching. The footsteps weren't hurried, but they were relentless, each one sending a jolt of dread through my body. I wanted to run, but I was frozen, my feet rooted to the floor as the sound grew louder, closer. The footsteps stopped just outside the door I had entered. I stared at it, my whole body tense, waiting for the handle to turn or the door to burst open. Nothing happened. The silence was unbearable, worse than the sound itself. I gripped the book tightly, its weight anchoring me as my mind raced for a way out. I glanced back at the map in my other hand. The spiral had changed again, now pointing to another door at the far end of the car. I forced myself to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the door, the sound started again, this time behind me, inside the car. Slow, measured footsteps just like before. I didn't dare turn around. My heart pounded in my ears as I reached the door and tried the handle. Locked. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled with the map and book, hoping for some kind of answer. The map's spiral seemed to twist in on itself, the lines flickering as if they were alive. Then, a word appeared on the page, written in jagged letters that seemed to bleed into the paper. Jump. Without thinking, I looked toward the windows. They were no longer opaque. They showed the outside, a swirling vortex of darkness, stars, and fragments of impossible landscapes flashing by. Jumping felt insane, but the footsteps were getting closer, and the pressure in the air was crushing me. I threw the book aside, grabbed the window latch, and forced it open. The vortex roared, pulling at me, cold and violent. With no time to hesitate, I climbed onto the edge, the hum of the train now deafening, the footsteps just behind me. I jumped. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no air, no sense of direction. I was falling, or maybe floating, through the void. Colors and shapes flashed around me, indescribable and maddening. My mind felt like it was being stretched, torn apart by the sheer impossibility of it all. Then, with a violent jolt, I hit the ground. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the station where it all began. The fog was still thick, the platform empty. The Noctis train was gone. I looked around, my body trembling, trying to make sense of how I was here. My hands were empty. The map and book were gone, though the memory of them was burned into my mind. To this day, I don't know what happened on that train, or why I was spared when so many others were not. I've scoured forums, spoken to people who claim to know about the Noctis train, but no one has answers. Some say it's a myth, a story to scare people. But I know it's real. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, that faint hum, vibrating in my bones, reminding me that I'll never truly escape. It was 2016, and I was in my final semester of biology school. At the time, I had a small group of friends who shared my passion for outdoor activities. The nights we ventured out on trails were an escape from the heavy routine of studying and mandatory internships that drained our energy. On that specific day, an autumn Friday, we decided to do something different, a nighttime hike in a forest reserve on the outskirts of the city. I must admit, the idea of exploring such a vast place, lit only by the silver glow of the moon, felt both thrilling and a little eerie. We arrived at the starting point around 9 at night. The air was damp, and a thin mist rose in waves that mingled with the scent of wet earth. It was an enchanting scene, with a beauty that bordered on the haunting. There were 4 of us. Me, Laura, who had a quick laugh and short bleached hair. Kaio, always the most skeptical in the group and a true lover of supernatural stories. And Julia, who carried her analog camera, ready to capture any intriguing shadow that crossed our path. With flashlights in hand and light backpacks, we started down the trail, carefree, chuckling softly and making comments about the urban legends surrounding the place. For about half an hour, everything went smoothly. We talked about the types of glowing fungi we might see and the distant calls of owls that lent an air of tranquility. Then, everything changed. When we approached a part of the trail where the trees formed a natural arch, silence fell like a curtain. No insects, no wind whispering through the leaves. Just a silence so dense it felt as though it moved with us. I paused for a moment, feeling my heart start to race for no apparent reason, and I noticed the others had sensed it too. Laura looked at me with wide eyes, and Kaio muttered, more to himself than to any of us, "This isn't normal." The discomfort grew, an invisible weight pressing down on our shoulders as we walked a few more meters. Julia, usually carefree, clutched her camera to her chest like a talisman. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed among the trees, so sharp it felt like it came from right next to us. We all stopped and exchanged glances, trying to mask our unease. I looked around, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand, and a shiver ran down my spine as I noticed the shadows moving in strange ways, as if the beam of light was distorted. Kaio forced a nervous laugh. "It's probably just an animal. A deer, maybe." Before we could respond, Laura stepped forward and whispered, almost breathless, "Do you guys see that?" I followed her gaze and, for a moment, thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. In the middle of the trail, a little further ahead, a tall, thin figure was partially hidden between the trunks. It didn't look human, but it didn't look like an animal either. The light from my flashlight barely reached that far, but I could make out the skeletal outline, long arms, and an elongated face that, even in the dimness, seemed to be looking right at us. A wave of panic surged through me. The hair on my body stood on end, and I had the sudden feeling that if we didn't move, we'd be swallowed by that presence. No one spoke. There was no need. In an instant, we all began to step back, our movements hesitant and our eyes fixed on the thing that remained motionless. My heart pounded in my chest, and it felt as though the air had become heavier, each breath a struggle. Somewhere behind us, a low sound, almost like a muffled laugh, echoed. Julia let out a whimper and instinctively grabbed my hand with a vice-like grip. My muscles locked as I realized the figure ahead was starting to move, not toward us, but in an erratic way, gliding between the trees, each step accompanied by a dry snap of branches. Adrenaline surged through my body, and every cell felt like it was on high alert. The sound of snapping continued, growing louder as the figure moved. But the most unsettling thing was that the noises didn't seem to follow a logical direction. Sometimes they came from ahead, other times behind or to the sides. Kaio, who always had a joke ready, was now silent, his face pale in the flickering beam of his flashlight. We tried to keep retreating, but the trail was uneven, and soon I stumbled over a thick root, falling to my knees. Julia screamed, a sound that came out muffled, as if the forest itself had swallowed part of her voice. Laura crouched down quickly to help me up, and that's when I noticed the absolute silence had been replaced by a low, drawn-out murmur, as if dozens of voices were whispering in some ancient language. My blood ran cold, and I wanted to shout for everyone to run, but my throat felt closed, incapable of producing any sound. Suddenly, one of the flashlights went out, casting part of us into darkness. Kaio shook his head, repeating, "No, no, this can't be happening." But we all knew that as much as we wished it was a prank, this was far from being a joke. I finally managed to stand up, and Laura and I started running, pulling Julia along while Kaio stumbled behind us, tripping over stones and roots. The forest, once familiar, now felt like an endless maze of shadows and gnarled trunks. The murmur grew louder, becoming almost deafening, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving along the edges of the trail, peering between the trees, eyes glinting with whatever light was left. My heart raced faster than ever, and all I could think was that we needed to get out of there at any cost. We ran without stopping, our feet kicking up dry leaves and snapping branches under our weight. The sound behind us seemed to multiply, now an echo of heavy steps that, somehow, matched our rhythm. My mind tried to rationalize, but the feeling of being hunted was too strong to ignore. Laura tripped, dropping her flashlight, which rolled to a stop with its light pointed at a hollow log. For a split second, it revealed a thin, long hand that quickly retreated into the dark, as if it knew it had been seen. Kaio rushed past me and shouted, "Don't stop! For God's sake, keep going!" His voice was higher pitched than usual, the urgency clear. Julia was crying softly, her labored breaths a reminder that despite the terror, we were still alive and fighting to stay that way. I picked up Laura's flashlight and handed it back to her as we pressed on. The trail seemed longer than we remembered, the familiar details now distorted by the shifting shadows cast by the flickering light. The murmur from before now sounded like distant, mocking laughter echoing through the branches. Suddenly, a shrill, inhuman scream cut through the air, making us stop in our tracks. It was a high-pitched, almost metallic sound that turned my stomach. The ground seemed to vibrate slightly, as if something large was approaching, something much bigger than any animal that could inhabit that reserve. Laura clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and looked at me with pure panic. It was then that I realized we couldn't just keep running aimlessly. We had to come up with a plan. I scanned the area, looking for some kind of refuge, and my eyes locked onto a small wooden cabin half hidden among the vegetation, about 20 meters to the right of the trail. There, the cabin. "Let's go," I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. Without a second thought, we all sprinted in the direction I pointed, branches scratching our arms and the murmur turning into a chorus of angry whispers. The cabin door was ajar, and when we pushed it open, it creaked loudly, as if protesting our intrusion. The interior was dark and smelled of old wood and dampness, but at least inside, the sound seemed more distant, as if the structure itself offered us fragile protection. Kaio threw himself against the door and locked it with a rusty bolt, panting heavily. "This won't hold for long," he muttered, sweat dripping down his face. Julia was curled up in a corner, clutching her camera as if it were her lifeline. Laura paced back and forth, her frightened expression replaced by desperate determination. "We need light," she said, rummaging through the room until she found an old oil lamp, which, surprisingly, still had a bit of fuel. With a quick spark, a flickering flame came to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For a brief moment, there was silence. The murmur stopped, and the only sound was our ragged breathing. The feeling of being watched, however, remained heavy like the thick air around us. I approached a small window covered in cobwebs and looked outside. What I saw made me recoil with a gasp stuck in my throat. Between the trees, dozens of glowing eyes were staring at us, motionless, in something that resembled a human silhouette, but too tall and too thin, swayed slightly, as if mocking our helplessness. Laura saw my expression and, without needing to ask, understood we still weren't safe. The silence was broken by a subtle sound, scratching on the wood from somewhere outside the cabin. We all exchanged glances, frozen by fear, and Julia whispered, her voice trembling, "What if it's not just one?" The scratching continued, louder each time, as if something were testing the strength of the walls. The lamp crackled and flickered, threatening to go out, making Laura mutter a low curse and press her palm against her forehead as if trying to think of a solution. Kaio, still leaning against the door, looked at me with a mix of panic and resignation. "We need a way out. We won't last if that thing decides to come in." I scanned the cabin hurriedly, my eyes locking onto a trapdoor partially hidden under an old rug. I pointed at it, signaling for Kaio and Laura to help me. We hastily pulled the rug aside and opened the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase leading down to a dark basement. The smell rising from below was of earth and damp wood, but it seemed to be our only chance. "Get down quickly," I whispered, trying to steady my breath that came out in short gasps. Laura was the first to descend, followed by Julia, who still clutched her camera like a charm. Kaio hesitated for a moment, looking at the door as if expecting something to slam against it at any moment. A louder crack, like claws scraping forcefully against the wood, finally made him move. I was the last one down, closing the trapdoor over our heads, and only then did I notice how our hearts beat in sync with the pounding of fear. The noise above continued for a few minutes more, and then absolute silence fell. The silence was even more terrifying than the previous noises. There, in the basement, we were surrounded by darkness, and only Laura's lamp cast light on our pale faces. Each of us tried not to make a sound, holding our breath as the minutes crawled by like hours. I felt like time had stopped, that we were trapped in a bubble where only fear and anticipation existed. Then Julia broke the silence, whispering, Do you think it's gone?" No one answered, but the hope in her voice echoed within us, even if only for a moment. I decided to go up slowly and peek through the trapdoor. My heart pounded so loudly that I feared it would attract whatever was still outside. I lifted the cover just enough to get a view of the cabin. The room was empty, the shadows now still and the lamp still lit on the makeshift table. Nothing seemed to have been moved or destroyed. I breathed a sigh of relief and signaled for the others to come up. We stepped out of the basement cautiously, our muscles tense from so much time on high alert. Kaio, still panting, whispered, "Let's get out of here now, before anything changes its mind." We all agreed in silence, grabbed our backpacks, and turned off the lamp. The night outside was brighter, as if the moon had decided to watch over us, protecting us with its cold light. We walked quickly but steadily back to the trail, not daring to look back. There were no more murmurs, no more cracking sounds, just the distant hoots of owls and the rustling of the wind through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, we finally saw the glow of the streetlights where our car was parked. No one said a word until we got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As we drove home in silence, Laura broke the tension. "No one's going to believe this if we tell them." Kaio laughed, but it was a nervous, almost bitter laugh. "I'm not even sure I believe it myself. Whatever that thing was, it stayed behind in the darkness of the trail. But even now, sometimes, when the night is utterly silent, I still hear a faint murmur, like a distant memory, and I wonder if we really got away."